A compilation of statements submitted in writing will be distributed to the member states after the meeting. Now, without further delay, I invite Mr. Omar al-Shugre, a Syrian refugee and human rights activist, to brief us. Mr. al-Shugri, you have the floor.
It's an honor for me to address the members of the Security Council, and I would like to thank the Estonian ambassador and all the co-sponsors for making this important meeting possible. If you were presented with the opportunity to save an innocent life without risking your own, would you do it? Most people would. Ladies and gentlemen, the opportunity is presenting itself today. It presented itself yesterday and every day since March 15th of 2011. That is 3,912 missed opportunities to save innocent lives in Syria. In that time, more than 350,000 people has been killed by the Syrian regime, according to the United Nations. I could have been one of those 350,000 people who were killed. As a child, I was detained by the Syrian regime. For 3 years, I was detained, I was starved, tortured, within an inch of my life. Instead, I'm standing before you today as an example of an innocent life being saved. My mother saved my life. Her name is Hala, and I want you to remember that name. Despite her husband, my father, and her sons, my brothers, being slaughtered in front of her eyes during a massacre in my village Al-Baida, where Assad regime and its Iranian allies murdered every man, every woman, every child, even the elderly, the trees, the animals. Very few people survived. Among them was my mother. She led hundreds to safety, and in doing so, she had the courage to stand up to the brutal dictatorship that held me captive for 3 years. And instead of complaining about her limitations, she found a way to take actions. And despite many failed attempts to get me out of prison, she kept trying again and again. She persisted until I was freed. Her actions may seem like an isolated event, but I believe that by saving me from prison, my mother set an example of how we all must act to stop the Syrian regime from taking more lives and hold its leaders accountable for the countless lives it has already taken. It does not require a miracle. It just requires courage, action, and persistence. During my time in detention, specifically in branch 215, I was tasked with numbering the dead human beings, including those of my own family members, in a room where they collected all the dead bodies. During these horrible years of my life in Assad prisons, there was a single month, one single month, where it was different. There was less torture. I even numbered less dead bodies. We get more food. I was surprised. But after I was released out of prison, I went back to the media to check what happened at that month. And it was this action, this stop of torture and allowing the food to enter was after the public release of the evidence called the Caesar file. The guards feared that they will be actually held accountable. Unfortunately, the world turned away and the machinery of death continued. So it was only 1 month. I have had the honor of meeting with Caesar, a brave, humble man who, in 2.5 years in Damascus alone, documented almost 55,000 photos of women, children, and elderly who've been tortured to death. Today we have the photos, the documents of the command responsibility, the photographer, the camera, and the flash drives. We have stronger evidence today than what we had against the Nazis in Nuremberg. But still, no international court and no end to the ongoing slaughter of the civilians in Syria. Recognizing the effect of the regime's action on their own interests, some countries like Germany have already taken legal actions against key members of the Syrian regime. In doing so, they have challenged the limitations of the international system, using the power of their national courts to uphold basic principles of human rights and international law. However, these efforts are simply not enough. I understand that there are barriers to actions, but I also believe in the international system, in the United Nations and the principles they were founded upon. Ladies and gentlemen, today more than half of the Syrian population are displaced inside and outside the country. Well over 350,000 people have been killed, and hundreds of thousands remain in Assad political prisons. Earlier today, I spoke on the phone with another individual, another Syrian individual, who I'm honored to call actually a friend of mine by now, whom from 2011 to 2017 was tasked by the Assad regime intelligence services to bury civilians murdered from Damascus and around Damascus. Every single week, he buried hundreds and hundreds of innocent victims of Assad machinery of death. His testimony is proof that what Caesar documented and what I numbered continues to this day. We even know where the mass graves are located. There are countless Syrians who are willing to bear witness to our never again moment. The United Nations, I think, should support organizations like the Syrian Emergency Task Force and other organizations that have been working and documenting the war crimes in Syria and work on to support the prosecutions. And the United Nations should support the mechanisms that exist, like the IIIM, that actually being provided and documenting the most brutalities of the Assad regime. As long as the international community is not an option to pursue national effort for the pursuit of justice and accountability, these organizations need to be supported, and we should support the establishment of a court that can serve the same purpose. Because the people I numbered, including my best of friends and my cousins who died with me in prison, the people that Caesar photographed, and the people that the grave digger, to the lack of name that describe his responsibility, the people who he buried they all gone. My family, my father and my brothers were massacred. They are gone. It's too late to save them. The victims of the many chemical weapons attacks that happened in Syria by the Syrian regime, they are gone. We can't save them. It's too late to save them. But there are millions that can still be saved. And that is my biggest ask to you, that you save them, that you stop the ongoing crimes, that you stop the killing in Syria. So when you wake up tomorrow, before you check your phone or do anything else, try to ask yourself the question. I invite you to ask yourself the question. If you were presented with the opportunity to save an innocent life without risking your own, would you do it? Because most people would. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Shugri, for this very personal account. I now give the floor to Professor Klaus Kress, Professor of Criminal Law and Public International Law, University of Cologne. Mr. Kress, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is an extremely precious and important opportunity to brief members of the Security Council and all other attendees today on the contribution of Germany's criminal justice system to accountability for international crimes committed in Syria. In February this year, a German court in the city of Koblenz convicted a former member of one of the Syrian intelligence services for participation in crimes against humanity. The accused was found guilty of having aided in 2011 in the commission of multiple acts of torture and imprisonment. Those acts, the court held, formed part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. Regarding this attack, the court determined that as from at least the end of April 2011, Syria's security forces, and in particular several intelligence services of that state, have been carrying out a campaign of killing, arbitrary detention, and torture against members of, or even only presumed members of, a peaceful movement of opposition to the Assad regime. The court further determined that this campaign was carried out pursuant to a policy to eliminate the rapidly growing peaceful protest and to intimidate the Syrian population in order to prevent possible further protests. This policy, the court determined further, was the policy of the state leadership of Syria, that is, the Assad regime. In my view, the court's finding that as from April 2011, the Assad regime has been orchestrating a criminal campaign of killing, arbitrary detention, and torture against its own civilian population constitutes the most important element of the Koblenz judgment. To the best of my knowledge, it was for the first time at all that such a finding was reached by a court of law as a result of a criminal trial which involved the taking and the evaluating of an extensive body of evidence. The judgment was declared in open court, and it is currently on appeal. As of yet, the written judgment is not public. The criminal proceedings which resulted in the judgment of the Koblenz court were challenging because obviously no investigative measures could be taken in Syria. So how could the court nevertheless arrive at its carefully reasoned decision? Importantly, the accused person was cooperative to a very large extent. And quite a few more former deserted members of Syrian intelligence services testified as witnesses during the proceedings. Also, numerous victims were present in Germany as refugees and could provide witness testimony. I should add that not infrequently, those courageous victims have been benefiting from measures of witness protection because of credible threats of retaliation by the Syrian regime against relatives that had remained in Syria. Furthermore, when it came to prove the overall criminal campaign against the civilian population, the so-called Caesar files, which had just been mentioned by my previous speaker, played an important role. These files consist of more than 25,000 picture files displaying the dead bodies of about 6,800 human beings. They were put together, as we just heard, by a Syrian military photographer commonly referred to as CISA. The CISA files had been made available to Germany's Federal Prosecution Office, and they had been subjected to a meticulous examination by an eminent forensic physician at the University of Cologne in Germany. The expert found that the pictures do indeed display dead bodies, and that those bodies, in their overwhelming majority, show traces of very serious mistreatment. I have seen some pictures myself. There are no words to describe their horror. The unspeakable pain inflicted on the victims concerned must shock the conscience of humankind. The court found the expert opinion by the forensic physician entirely persuasive with respect to the existence of a criminal pattern of killing and torture in detention facilities run by Syrian intelligence services. The Koblenz trial thus provides yet another example for the importance of forensic pathologist expertise in trials for international crimes. The Koblenz trial also demonstrates the usefulness of modern forms of transnational cooperation when it comes to the investigation into international crimes. To name just one example, the German authorities could themselves take certain witness testimonies in France because a so-called French-German joint investigation team had been formed. In addition, the Koblenz trial benefited from the work of the Commission of Inquiry established in 2011 by the United Nations Human Rights Council and by the work of several non-governmental organizations. Those proceedings have been the most important instance to date of the application of Germany's Code of Crime against international law. This code exists since 2002, and its basic idea is to enable Germany to make a contribution to the prosecution of crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, such as crimes against humanity. The code contains a comprehensive codification of crimes under customary international law. And crucially, the code allows Germany's federal prosecutor to activate, where practically feasible, its so-called universal jurisdiction over international crimes committed abroad. It is this jurisdictional power that enabled the highly professional international crimes experts within Germany's Federal Prosecutor's Office to open investigations of a more general scope into crimes allegedly committed in Syria as early as in September 2011. Germany's federal prosecutor, as well as Germany's federal police agency, were thus well prepared when several years later the accused flew to Germany. Apart from the power of universal jurisdiction, the Koblenz proceedings were possible because the suspect did not enjoy immunity, despite having acted in official capacity. The fundamental international legal principle of non-applicability of functional immunity in proceedings for international crimes was recognized as early as in the groundbreaking judgment delivered at Nuremberg in 1946. The same principle has been confirmed by Germany's Federal Court of Justice in a landmark judgment just a month before the Koblenz judgment. The Koblenz trial provides yet another piece of evidence of just how important it will be for the United Nations International Law Commission to also confirm this principle in its current work on immunities in foreign criminal proceedings. The Koblenz judgment does not constitute an isolated exercise of Germany's criminal jurisdiction. A second judgment in a case against a former Syrian intelligence service member is expected to be delivered in the months to come. And German criminal courts have not only been proceeding against former organs of the Syrian state. Importantly, a number of criminal proceedings have also been conducted or are ongoing against members of the so-called Islamic State. With respect to the crimes against humanity committed pursuant to a policy of the leadership of the state of Syria, the Koblenz judgment is no doubt encouraging. At the same time, this judgment constitutes no more than a very modest contribution to ensure accountability for those crimes. This is all the more so as the former Syrian official convicted at Koblenz was no Syrian leader, and hence certainly not among those most responsible for the crimes against humanity committed in Syria. Hence, one can only hope that national criminal proceedings in countries other than Germany will proceed, were already ongoing, and will be instituted wherever practicable. For those purposes, the Koblenz judgment could be made available to other states on request through interstate judicial assistance, and the same applies, for example, for the expert opinion submitted by the forensic pathologist in that trial. This same opinion has already been shared with the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, which very helpfully has translated that opinion into English to facilitate its use beyond German proceedings. The mechanism has also been of great assistance to German judicial authorities on a number of occasions in the course of investigations in Syrian cases. All this is to suggest that interstate cooperation, as complemented by the mechanism, will remain crucial. And it is high time for states to enhance such cooperation by moving forward on the International Law Commission's draft convention on crimes against humanity. And yet, national proceedings will often face limitations in their reach, and those limitations may be felt most painfully when it comes to those allegedly most responsible. The most obvious forum for those suspects remains the International Criminal Court. The potential of a Security Council referral of the Syrian conflict to this court has therefore lost nothing of its very strong desirability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Professor Kress, for your comprehensive overview. I now invite Ms. Catherine Markey-Huel, head of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, to brief us.
Thank you, Excellency. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's meeting is important. It is important for the victims and survivors of the tragic events in the Syrian Arab Republic. Important for the many courageous civil society actors risking their lives to document atrocities. Important for the prosecutors and judges in other countries piecing together events that happened far away to contribute some elements of justice to a devastating situation. First and foremost, today's meeting is important because it reiterates the role of the Security Council and serves as a firm reminder of the need to discuss, to find solutions, and to take action. Justice and accountability, respect for human rights, and compliance with international humanitarian law is not a question of politics. It is and should always be a question of principle. It is part of the raison d'être of this Council, the guardian of international peace and security. The atrocities in Syria are among the most devastating and barbaric since the end of World War II, reflecting contempt for human rights and fundamental freedoms. 10 years after the protests began, a German Court of Justice, as you've just heard, in Koblenz, found that crimes against humanity were committed pursuant to a policy to eliminate the rapidly growing peaceful protest and to intimidate the Syrian population to prevent future protests. The court confirmed that killing, arbitrary detention, and torture form part of a widespread and systematic attack by the Syrian state, its security forces, and secret services against the civilian population. An ongoing armed conflict in Syria provided the breeding ground for further core international crimes allegedly perpetrated by individuals affiliated with various state and non-state actors, including ISIL, Daesh. The international community, especially this Council, has been unable to effectively address the situation. In the meantime, parties to the conflict continue to make use of all available means to pursue their objective at all costs, disregarding rules and norms of humanity and lawful warfare. We have just heard from Professor Crest about the systematic imprisonment, torture, and killing of protesters and opponents. The list of alleged crimes is much longer. Unlawful attack, including against schools, medical facilities, and personnel, the use of chemical weapons, violent discriminatory acts based on ethnicity, gender, religion, politics, and other grounds, the pervasive use of gender-based crimes, including sexual violence, as well as crimes committed against unaffected children. The documentation of the situation is overwhelming and insufficient at the same time. Many states, civil society actors, and international organizations, including the UN Commission of Inquiry and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, have documented violations and crimes for the past decade. The information is diverse in format, including witness statement, photos, video, satellite imagery, physical evidence, forensic samples, intercepted communications, analytical expert reports, and more. However, many actors have not gathered or analyzed the information using criminal law methodologies. Its provenance has not always been sufficiently documented to make it usable in court as evidence, and original sources cannot always be traced. Further analysis is needed to establish a crime base, including contextual requirements to charge and prove war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are gaps in the information required to establish crucial linkage between individuals and the crimes. In other words, in spite of an abundance of documentation, critical elements are missing to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of core international crimes committed in Syria since March 2011. This is why in 2016, 105 states in the General Assembly decided to create the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria, which I have the honor to lead. We apply criminal law methodologies and standards, preserve and aggregate evidence, fill in gaps, and prepare analytical products and case files to support existing and future justice avenues. For now, and in the absence of ICC jurisdiction or the creation of another international court or tribunal, our work predominantly supports national jurisdictions. To date, we have received 162 requests for assistance in relation to 133 distinct investigations from 13 different jurisdictions. Many of the national war crimes units cooperate with each other, as we've heard, for instance, through the genocide network hosted by Eurojust and in the form of joint investigations. Such coordinations led to international arrest warrants of selected senior Syrian intelligence officials. Investigations and trials concern current and former members of the Syrian state apparatus, members of ISIL or Daesh, as well as members of other non-state armed groups, including foreign terrorist fighters. We know that in addition to jurisdictional challenges, national war crimes units have limited resources and operational capacities. We make every effort to assist them. We conduct searches in our central repository of information and evidence. We've developed adaptable evidentiary modules to enable charging of core international crimes. We connect domestic judicial authorities to witnesses and also carry out interviews for those authorities upon request. We assist in the geolocation of crime scenes and other relevant sites. We commission relevant expert reports, for instance, in relation to the use of chemical weapons. At the same time, we are developing strategies and action plans to ensure that we can better surface gender-based crimes, including sexual violence, that we can address the full range of crimes committed against children, and that the information in our possession can benefit the search for missing persons in Syria. By doing so, we hope to implement practical approaches informed by the voices of victims and survivors and their demands for justice and accountability. Besides ongoing criminal processes, there are also efforts to examine whether Syria has violated its obligation as a state party to the Convention Against Torture. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all these judicial developments are welcome, of course, but they are insufficient to address the scale and gravity of the Syrian situation or to decisively deter future crimes, whether in Syria or elsewhere. More is required to ensure that one day a peaceful Syria can be built based on the rule of law. For this, we need action by the international community and the Security Council. Any council member, whether elected or permanent, whether from the northern, southern, eastern, or western part of the globe, should be able to agree on the need for impartial and comprehensive accountability as a point of principle. It's been several years since the Council has had any dedicated discussion about accountability in Syria. What signal does it send to the world and to the Syrian people if we don't even engage to find solution? The worst option for the Security Council is to stop talking and deliberating, because it means that you've stopped trying and given up. This is why I sincerely thank the mission of Estonia for hosting today's meeting and all the co-sponsors. I hope today's discussion will help reinvigorate debates of the international community, first and foremost the Security Council. We owe it to the victims, survivors, and the Syrian people. We must keep trying. My team and I pursue our work because we're convinced that the day for comprehensive justice and accountability will come. It is only a question of time. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marquivel, for your pertinent insights. And I now invite our last panelist, Ms. Vahd Al-Khatib, a Syrian journalist and film director, to brief us. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. I'm expected to start this session today by telling you how it's an honor to be here, but I can't. Not if I want to be genuine to the suffering of my people. My biggest honor was and still is that I'm part of the Syrian revolution, which made me hold into hope with my fellow Syrians, chanting in the streets, daring to dream of dignity, freedom, and the state of law. I'm known by Vahd Al-Khatib, which is not my name, a name I chose to hide my identity from the security forces, the same mukhabarat that Omar just talked about, who arrested him and tortured him. Omar, who survived today and who gave us so much courage and hope. I talk to you today as an activist who protested, who was beaten, who was shot at, demanding democracy for my country. I talk to you as a mother who gave birth to my first child in a makeshift hospital in East Aleppo, where I was living with my husband, Hamza. Hamza, who's here today, he was an emergency doctor managing the last remaining hospital, which was deliberately targeted by the Syrian regime supported by Russia. I'm talking to you as a refugee who was forcibly displaced after the besiegement of Aleppo in 2016. And now, I'm hearing so many from your country's officials and media talking about how safe it is for us to be returned to Syria. Syria is not safe as long as Assad is still ruling. And I talk to you as a filmmaker, who I thought that my mission would be just to deliver the injustice I documented to the world. I and many Syrians, we used to have faith that the world won't let us down, that you, the Security Council, would do everything to stop the war crimes and the genocide in Syria. One of the women I filmed while we were in besieged Aleppo shouted to deliver this to you. She said, with a baby of 6 months old, film, let the whole world see this. At that moment, I was worried that I would let her down, that I won't be able to survive, and her message will die with me. However, the major disappointment came after I shared her shouting out to the world and to you. You refused to acknowledge, and this council refused to act. I talk to you today as one of millions of Syrian witnesses and survivors of what is defined as war crimes and crimes against humanity by laws that you states have created. But where is the outrage when your laws are broken? Where is the action? This council remains a spectator of the Syrian people. And if you think I'm angry, yes, for sure you are right. You have let us down. Your council held countless meetings through all these events of my life. There are 42 reports only by the UN Mission of Inquiry, and this does not include Amnesty, Physicians for Human Rights, OPCW, and tens of Syrian organizations' reports. And all of this, some of you now discussing renewing diplomatic relations with the Syrian regime and granting lucrative contracts to warlords to reconstruct the Assad's regime and what he has destroyed in our country. Because this council has failed to hold those responsible to account, we Syrians, along with states and international lawyers, have been exploring alternative ways to do so ourselves. For an example, closely with the legal team at Guernica 37, we are working to hold Russia accountable for its targeting of hospitals and medical workers before the European Court of Human Rights, a court stemming out of a treaty that Russia agreed to. The Russian state, the Russian judicial authorities, have done nothing to investigate and prosecute such conduct into the international loss of life. So we must now seek to hold the state accountable for its failures, and we will do so. We are also working with some states present here to establish collective international action against individuals responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The evidence is there. The perpetrators are known. All that remains is the will. It's essential that there is a credible international process to investigate and prosecute the use of chemical, biological, and other forms of forbidden weapons in Syria. And we have identified ways to do so. I'm here to ask you, how are you going to be part of the accountability effort? We are here today to seek accountability, not only to heal the past, but also to protect the political hope for the future. One day, Syrians will go out into the street. They will shout again, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. It's our responsibility today to make sure that they won't face war crimes. It's your responsibility, in your power, to prevent genocide, not only in Syria, but in the whole world. What messages are you sending to us, to your people, and to your children? What will the next conflict look like if impunity persists? It's okay to torture people. It's okay to kill children. It's okay to bomb hospitals. What sort of legacy are you leaving behind for the next generation? Today, as we speak, there's over 3 million civilians living in Idlib, facing the daily threat of their schools and hospitals being targeted, their villages of being bombed. We don't want them, and we don't want one of them to be sitting in my place next year, briefing you again about what happened in the next year. We want you all to do your part to save them all. I'm copying what Omar asked for, what Catherine and Professor Lucas Klaus said. You have to save them all. Sama, my 6-year-old daughter, asked me before I come here why I have to go to New York City. I said, do you remember the kids in Idlib who the monster just killed? I have to go to speak about them. She sadly said, but they are already dead. Why do you need to go? For a second, I didn't know what to say. Then I told her, I'm trying. I'm trying to do my part so other children won't be killed. So I leave you today with this question, and adding another one to what Omar asked. If your children ask you the same thing, will you be able to look them into the eyes and say that you, as state members of the Security Council, are able to do your part? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Khatib, for this personal and touching overview. Thank you, Ms. Al-Khatib, for this touching and really personal overview. And I asked the technicians whether we are ready to see a video. Can we get the sound? What a moving image. We have now heard our last panelist, and I now invite the co-sponsors to take the floor. And I first give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the briefers for the powerful testimony we have heard today, for the clarity, the courage, and the hope they have shown through sharing their experiences and their responses to them. As the General Assembly emphasised in Resolution 71-248, when it set up the IIIM, accountability for violations and abuses in Syria, many of which may be war crimes or crimes against humanity, is vital. Accountability would ensure justice for victims, would contribute to the prevention of future violations, and would help to bring about reconciliation and sustainable peace as part of a political process aimed at resolving the conflict in Syria. The UK commends and appreciates those committed to the painstaking task of documenting and collecting evidence throughout the conflict. This includes the IIIM, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the work by Syrian and international civil society actors. The UK recognizes the importance of accountability through our cooperation with investigation and its funding. In the face of a Security Council that has too often been blocked from taking effective action, we welcome accountability efforts under domestic jurisdictions, which have led to the first conviction of a former member of Daesh and the conviction in a German court for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity in Syria. But the Security Council needs to do more, much more, on accountability. In this regard, the Security Council should, first, insist that justice and reconciliation be a central part of the political process. The importance of accountability was recognized in the 2012 Geneva Communiqué. Second, continue to demand that all parties in Syria comply with their obligations under international law. Third, resolutely uphold its resolutions on Syria. This includes insisting on accountability for the use of chemical weapons, demanding full compliance with Resolution 2118, actively supporting the OPCW, and standing up to those who seek to undermine it. Fourth, put justice for victims of violations and abuses first, and reconsider a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Fifth, demand answers on the missing. Families and survivors have suffered for long enough. They deserve access to information about their loved ones, which in itself is a step towards justice. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Estonia, for your leadership in organizing today's discussion. And we're pleased to be a co-sponsor. I also want to thank as well all of the briefers today. The United States holds deep admiration and gratitude for the Syrian civil society participants who bravely continue to document atrocities and demand justice for victims. Your work is not easy. I'm personally inspired by your tireless efforts to bring attention to the prevailing impunity in Syria for past and continued international crimes, including crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Your harrowing testimony should shock all members of this council and other UN member states to take action. Just a few days ago, I walked through Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, and I met with Syrian refugees who are working to put the pieces of their lives back together after being devastated by the atrocities committed by the Assad regime. Hearing their hopes and dreams made me hopeful, but also sad. Hearing their fears reaffirmed for me that the situation in Syria is not safe for return at this moment. Hearing their and your stories has made me even more committed to ensuring that they and you receive justice. In 2012, Hayyan Mahmoud had just graduated from medical school. He had great promise ahead of him, a life full of saving and preserving the lives of others. But after attending a street protest against the brutal Syrian regime, he was arrested and taken to the notorious Damascus Detention Center, Branch 251. Only 12 days later, his family was called to collect Hayyan's body. He had died in custody. In less than 2 weeks, the lives of the Mahmoud family had changed forever. Years later, his brother was called upon to testify in a courtroom in Germany against a regime official. But he and others were seriously and rightfully concerned about the safety of his family who remained inside Syria, as the regime sought to intimidate potential witnesses. The search for accountability in Syria has been lengthy. It has been challenging and fraught with risk for those speaking out. Those who have sought to share the stories of the Assad regime's crimes and human rights violations have faced retribution from the long arms of the regime's security apparatus. In the end, after some of the family was able to safely exit, Hayyan's siblings testified in a German court. But their story is a rare exception. While the Mahmoud family finally received a measure of justice, accountability has proved far too elusive for most of the hundreds of thousands killed, the many wounded, and the millions who have been uprooted from their homes since the Syrian uprising. Families should not have to pay bribes to retrieve information about their loved ones. They should not have to wait for years to obtain the remains of their family members or learn where they have been buried. They should not have to beg for death certificates. We must support the ongoing efforts by national authorities to investigate and prosecute within their jurisdiction crimes committed in Syria. And while the road ahead remains long, we are encouraged by the progress made in this area, notably in Germany, where regime officials have been convicted for crimes against humanity. Accountability, justice, and respect for human rights are imperative for securing a stable, just, and enduring peace in Syria. The Assad regime's abuses, particularly its campaign of arbitrary detention and torture, affect every Syrian family. The United States strongly supports the work of the IIIM, the Commission of Inquiry, and other organizations and UN mechanisms that work to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of the atrocities the Assad regime, ISIS, and others have perpetrated against the Syrian people. But the international community must do more than just listen to testimonies and read reports. We have an obligation to act. After all, not only is accountability essential to bringing long overdue justice to the victims and their families, but it is also key to building confidence in the broader political process as called for in Resolution 2254. President Biden said in October that the lesson of the heart of the Nuremberg trials was finding truth and documenting it so it could never be denied. We must do the same for the Syrian people. The IIIM and the COI, with the support of states and brave Syrian human rights defenders, have not only found and documented the awful truth of the Assad regime's atrocities, but they have also meaningfully helped ensure criminal justice systems could not deny this truth through investigations, prosecutions, and convictions in independent national courts. We must maintain our unwavering commitment to them and to justice for all of the Syrian regime's victims. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to France.
Je voudrais, moi, à
Thank
mon
you.
tour, remercier Madame
I would also
Catherine
like to thank
Marchiuel
Ms. Catherine
et le professeur
Marchiuel,
Cross
Professor
pour leur
Klaus
présentation,
Kress for their briefings,
ainsi qu'Omar
and
Al-Shogre
also
et
Omar
Madame
Al-Shogre
Ouad
and
Al-Kadeab
Ms. Ouad
pour leur
Al-Kadeab
témoignage
for
puissant
their
et poignant
powerful and moving briefings
qui nous permet d'ouvrir cette séance
that
avec
allow
toute la
us to
solennité qui
open
s'impose.
this meeting with all the necessary
Après
solemnity.
plus de 10 ans de conflit,
After more than 10
la
years of
Syrie est ravagée.
conflict, Syria is ravaged.
La moitié de la population est
Half of
déplacée
the population has
ou
been
réfugiée dans les pays
displaced
voisins.
or is now refugees in
Plus de 13
neighboring
millions de
countries.
personnes ont besoin d'aide
More than
humanitaire.
13 million people need
Des dizaines de milliers de
humanitarian
personnes ont
assistance.
disparu.
Tens of thousands of people are missing.
Le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies
The
aux droits de
Office of
l'homme
the
a publié
United
le
Nations
24
High
septembre
Commissioner for
dernier
Human Rights
un bilan
on the 24th of
actualisé du
September
nombre de
published an
victimes du
update
conflit
of the number
en
of
Syrie.
victims of the conflict in
350
Syria.
209 victimes
350,209
comptabilisées entre mars
victims
2011 et
have been
mars
recorded
2021.
between March 2011 and March
La
2021.
résurgence de Daesh
The
dans le désert de la
resurgence of
Badia et
Daesh
dans la
in
vallée de
Badia
l'Euphrate,
Desert and the Euphrates
mais
Valley,
également la poursuite
but
des
also
hostilités
the
dans le
continued
nord-ouest et dans le
hostilities in
nord-est
the
constituent des
northwest and
signaux
the
extrêmement
northeast
inquiétants.
are extremely worrying signs.
Des actes susceptibles de constituer des crimes
Acts
de
that
guerre
could constitute
et des
war
crimes
crimes
contre l'humanité
and crimes against
continuent d'être
humanity
commis,
continue to be committed,
tout particulièrement par le régime
particularly by
syrien.
the Syrian regime.
Il est primordial d'obtenir
It is
des
essential
avancées rapides
that rapid
s'agissant
progress be
du
made
sort des
when it
personnes
comes to the
détenues
fate of
par le
persons
régime syrien
detained by
et
the
des
Syrian
personnes
regime
disparues.
and missing persons.
Les crimes commis en Syrie ne peuvent pas rester
Crimes
impunis.
committed in Syria cannot
Tous
go
les efforts doivent
unpunished.
être faits pour que
Every
justice soit
effort must be
rendue à
made to
toutes les
ensure that
victimes de
justice
ce
is
conflit.
done for all the victims of this conflict.
Depuis sa création, la France apporte son
Since it
plein
was
soutien
created,
au
France has
mécanisme
fully
d'enquête, le
supported
triple
the
IM,
IIIM,
qui joue un rôle de
which plays
répertoire
the
central
role of a
d'information,
central
d'éléments
repertory
de
of
preuve,
information and
de
evidence, and
facilitateur de la
also as a
justice.
facilitator
Et nous
of
saluons la prise
justice.
en compte systématique
We
des questions
welcome
qui sont
the
liées au genre
systematic
et aux violences
mainstreaming of
contre les
gender
femmes dans
issues and
l'ensemble de
issues
ses travaux.
related to violence against women in all
Les
of
défis
its
sont
work.
nombreux pour le triple
The
IM,
IIIM
en
faces
particulier dans
many
le contexte
challenges,
sanitaire
in
actuel,
particular in the
et nous nous
current
félicitons de voir
public
que
health
malgré cela,
context, and we are pleased
le
to see that
triple IM a
despite all
progressé
of
dans son
that,
mandat.
the IIIM
La
has
France
made
continuera
progress
de
in
se
its
mobiliser
mandate.
en lien
France will
avec ses
continue to
partenaires pour que le
mobilize together with its
financement de ce
partners to
mécanisme soit
ensure that the
maintenu sur le
financing of
budget
this
régulier des
mechanism be
Nations
kept
Unies,
under the United Nations
conformément aux
regular budget,
recommandations du secrétaire
in line
général.
with the recommendations of the Secretary General.
La France restera également
France
pleinement
will
engagée
also
dans la
remain
lutte contre
fully committed
l'impunité
in
qui
the fight against
constitue une
impunity,
condition
which
essentielle
is an
d'une
essential
paix durable
condition for
en Syrie.
lasting peace in Syria.
Nous saluons le courage infini,
We commend
remarquable des
the
acteurs de la
infinite,
société
remarkable
civile syrienne.
courage of Syrian
Nous les
civil
invitons à
society
poursuivre leur
actors, and we
coopération avec le
encourage them to
IIIM,
continue their
car leur
cooperation
contribution à
with
la
the
justice
IIIM,
est essentielle.
because their contribution to justice
De même,
is
les
essential.
mécanismes onusiens, notamment la
Equally,
commission
UN
d'enquête
mechanisms,
indépendante,
including the Independent Commission of
ainsi que les
Inquiry
mécanismes
and the
de
mechanisms
l'OIAC,
of the
comme l'enquête
OPCW,
indépendante
such as the
d'identification,
Investigation and
doivent continuer à
Identification
coopérer avec
Team,
le
must
IIIM
continue to
dans
cooperate
le
with the
cadre de leurs mandats
IIIM
respectifs.
in the framework of their
Nous
respective
rappelons également que la
mandates.
France
We
a
also
lancé
recall that
et qu'elle
France has
préside le
launched and
partenariat
chairs the
international
International
contre
Partnership
l'impunité de
against
l'utilisation
impunity for
d'armes
the use
chimiques,
of chemical weapons,
qui réunit aujourd'hui
which brings
40
together
États,
today
ainsi que l'Union
40
européenne.
states and the European Union.
Enfin, nous invitons tous les États
Lastly,
concernés par la lutte
We encourage
contre
all
l'impunité
states
en Syrie à
concerned by the fight
coopérer
against
avec le
impunity in
IIIM.
Syria to
La
cooperate
France a
with the
signé le 29
IIIM.
juin
On the
2021
29th of June
une convention de
2021,
coopération
France
judiciaire
signed an international
internationale
judicial
avec le
cooperation
IIIM et
convention
nous
with
encourageons les
the
juridictions
IIIM.
compétentes à
We
travailler
encourage
ensemble
competent
pour échanger
jurisdictions
les
to work
informations,
together
pour
to
mutualiser les
exchange
moyens
information and
en
pool
s'appuyant sur le
resources,
IIIM.
basing that
Une
work on
telle
the
coopération a
IIIM.
permis la tenue
This
du procès
cooperation
historique de
allowed for the
Koblenz en
conduct of the
Allemagne qui a été
historic
présenté
trial in
plus tôt,
Koblenz in Germany
et
that
plus
we
d'une
heard about
quarantaine
earlier,
d'enquêtes et
and more
d'informations
than some
judiciaires sont
40
actuellement en cours
judicial
en France.
inquiries and investigations that are currently
Pour
underway
conclure,
in
permettez-moi de
France.
réaffirmer qu'il ne
To
peut y avoir
conclude, allow me
de
to
paix
reiterate
durable
that there can be
en
no
Syrie, ni
lasting
de
peace
retour
in
des
Syria,
réfugiés ou des
nor the
déplacés
return
sans
of refugees
justice,
and displaced persons
ni
without
solution
justice
politique.
or a political
Seule
solution.
une solution politique crédible,
Only a
durable,
credible,
inclusive,
lasting,
en
and
conformité avec la
inclusive political
résolution
solution in
2254 du
accordance
Conseil de
with Resolution
sécurité permettra à la Syrie
2254
dans
of the
son
Security
ensemble
Council
de se
will allow
relever
all of Syria
et
to
d'éviter une
recover
nouvelle
and to
décennie
avoid
perdue.
another lost decade.
Il devient plus que jamais
It
urgent
is more
de
urgent than
mettre en
ever
place l'ensemble des volets de
that
cette
all of the
résolution
aspects
adoptée
of
à
this resolution
l'unanimité
be
par
put
les
in
membres du
place. The
Conseil,
resolution that was
et qui
adopted
demeure
unanimously
aujourd'hui
by
encore
the
la feuille de
members of
route
the
du
Council
Conseil.
and which
Nous
remains the
soutenons à
Council's
cet égard le
roadmap.
travail de l'envoyé
In this
spécial
respect, we
en ce
support the
sens.
work of the
La
Special
France est
Envoy in this
déterminée
area.
à obtenir des
France is
progrès sur
determined to get
l'ensemble de ces
progress
volets,
on
et
all
en
of these
particulier sur
aspects
la
and in
question des
particular
personnes
on
détenues
the
par le
question
régime
of
syrien
persons
et des
detained by
personnes
the
disparues.
Syrian regime
Je vous remercie.
and missing persons. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I give now the floor to Liechtenstein.
Chair, I want to pay tribute to those who have survived atrocities committed by the regime in Syria and those who have not given up in the fight for a peaceful and free country in the future, and to our two briefers who very well represent all these people. Today's discussion should have a focus on the interplay of peace and justice. The armed conflict in Syria is the best possible illustration that sustainable peace can only be achieved if supported by genuine accountability efforts. Those who bear the greatest responsibility for attacks on the civilian population and for countless war crimes cannot be part of a political arrangement that charters a peaceful future for the country. A look at other situations, Sudan or Myanmar, makes it clear what happens when those who commit atrocity crimes with impunity are allowed to occupy political leadership positions. So most importantly, in discussing solutions to the conflict in Syria, the Council should stop discussing this in a silo approach that treats the humanitarian, the political, and the accountability dimension separately. The task of ensuring sustainable peace is undoubtedly not the sole responsibility of the Security Council. Nevertheless, its actions are decisive for laying the basis for the relevant long-term efforts. Meaningful accountability work must be part of this. It is well known and has been mentioned here that the Council has the possibility of referring situations to the International Criminal Court. But past experience also shows that such referrals have been a mixed blessing for accountability efforts, as they were not backed up by the necessary resolve in the Council to ensure the required cooperation. In addition, the current political climate in the Council is not conducive to additional referrals. While it must be said, again, that the ICC was established precisely for the purpose of holding those most responsible for mass atrocity crimes committed in situations like Syria. But the Council has various other options to do meaningful accountability work. Other ways to prevent and end atrocity crimes. It can call on conflict parties to respect the international humanitarian law, call on states to investigate and prosecute crimes committed in their national systems and take measures if these calls are not heeded. This would have gone a long way to bring about a different dynamic in the situation of the Syrian conflict. But the message that was heard by the regime was the opposite, namely that committing war crimes and crimes against humanity is a winning political strategy. The Council should also welcome efforts undertaken in accordance with the principle of universal jurisdiction. Incomplete and indeed imperfect, as we have just seen, as they can be, but in the case of a situation like Syria, this remains for the time being the only path to accountability. A key player in these efforts is, of course, the IIIM, which the General Assembly created 5 years ago, not least in light of the vetoed ICC referral in the Council. We welcome the briefing by the head of the IIIM today and express our strong support for its excellent work. Its template has been replicated in other situations, and the IIIM has established itself quickly as part of the institutional landscape in the UN system. But for the work of the IIIM to take its full effect, accountability must be part and parcel of the political track and all serious efforts to chart a path for the country to sustainable peace. Voices from outside the Council are crucially important to support the relevant efforts inside the Council, and we will continue to be very vocal in this respect. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President, for organizing this event. Thank you for bringing back the attention of the Council to the prevailing impunity for the horrific crimes in Syria, crimes that were so vividly and so heartbreakingly described by Omar, by Wahid, shown in the video, which was very hard to watch, and exactly the reason why that video needed to be played here today, because that is the reality that we're discussing. And if there is a universal rule that exists that a downward spiral must be ultimately reversed for the better, Syria, unfortunately, is the tragic exception. 10 years after the start of peaceful protest in Syria and the subsequent violent repression, gross human rights violations still persist to this day. For all those Syrians affected by a decade of atrocities, accountability is long overdue, but let me be clear, not out of sight. Syrians need, they deserve, an international community that is committed to shared universal rights, a community that does not accept impunity. Mr. President, what can we do? Omar and Weed asked us. First, the key role of the international, impartial and independent mechanism has in ensuring accountability for the people of Syria. The IIIM has proven to be a unique international criminal justice entity to ensure that the crimes committed in Syria will not be forgotten. The collection, consolidation, preservation, and analysis of evidence and the preparation of case files are indispensable steps in the fight against impunity. The work of the IIIM is crucial in supporting accountability efforts at the national, regional, and international level. And through national and international accountability measures, including through prosecution based on universal jurisdiction, like in Germany, we are trying to fill the void of impunity and seek justice for those who suffered and continue to suffer. And in the same vein, the Netherlands and Canada have jointly invoked Syria's responsibility for human rights violations under international law, specifically holding Syria responsible for torture under the UN Convention Against Torture. And we will not accept a solution that fails to do justice to these victims of torture. It is these creative steps that keep the accountability effort alive. But more is needed, as unfortunately there is neither peace nor security in Syria. Here we look at the Security Council, which has a very clear task to maintain international peace and security and should consider all the tools at its disposal. And that still includes, in the opinion of my delegation, a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. And to conclude, we should remain adamant in reminding the Security Council of its duty and its mandate that it has taken on. We owe it to the people of Syria. They are the reason we are here today, and we must never forget that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sweden.
Thank you, Chair, and I would like to thank Estonia and the briefers for today's important and insightful Arria-formula meeting, which Sweden is proud to co-sponsor. The Swedish government deems accountability for the crimes committed in Syria to be a long-standing priority. This is an international human rights imperative and a matter of justice for the victims. In the case of Syria, our government also has a responsibility toward the Syrian diaspora in our country. Since the conflict began, Sweden has received over 180,000 refugees from Syria, many of them carrying harrowing stories of abuse and crime, as we have heard from Omar and other panelists today. It is clear that the Syrian regime carries the overwhelming responsibility for the crimes committed against its population. Meanwhile, the Commission of Inquiry and others have repeatedly reminded us that all parties to the conflict have committed and continue to commit the most serious international crimes. Nevertheless, we have so far not seen a comprehensive international effort to secure justice for what has happened and continues to happen in Syria today. That is why multilateral mechanisms such as the IIIM and the Commission of Inquiry play such an important, critical role. Due to the failure to secure international accountability for the heinous crimes committed, national prosecutions on the basis of universal jurisdiction have also become an important part of international efforts. This has been the case in Sweden and the Swedish prosecutors' approach to crimes in Syria. Swedish courts delivered the first sentence against a Syrian citizen for war crimes committed abroad in August 2016. From the first war crimes trial to the first conviction of a regime soldier, Sweden has been a pioneer in Europe in the prosecution of crimes committed in Syria. Today, the Swedish public prosecutor has a number of open investigations on Syrian cases. Thus far, 5 convictions have been handed down since 2016 against perpetrators from all sides of the conflict. This final fact bears repeating. The Swedish courts have dealt with cases where the alleged perpetrator has fought for or been associated with terrorist groups, local militias, so-called opposition forces, and the regime. The principle of universal jurisdiction is applicable in Sweden, regardless of who perpetrated the crime. The cooperation between Swedish authorities and the IIIM has so far achieved tangible results, and Sweden and the mechanism are currently discussing how to further strengthen our cooperation in information and evidence sharing. Even if national prosecutions outside Syria for crimes committed during the conflict in Syria constitute an important effort, they do not come close to addressing the magnitude of the Syrian crisis. This is why Sweden also continues to call for a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Thank you again for organizing this important meeting.
Thank you. I give the floor to Turkey.
Thank you, Chair. First, as the representative of a neighboring country, witnessing daily the pain endured and the bravery displayed by the Syrian people for over 10 years now, and providing care and hosting for 9 million Syrians, I would like to salute Ömer and Waad for their courageous and powerful testimonies. I also thank Professor Klaus Kress and Katrin Marchuhel of IIIM for their briefings. I wish also thank you personally for spearheading the organization of this timely meeting. It is critical that we keep the topic of accountability high on the agenda of the Security Council. Chair, for more than a decade now, Syrian people have suffered greatly in their unrelenting quest for freedom and dignity. They have endured unspeakable pain and loss due to the atrocities of the regime. Hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians have been killed. The Syrian regime has abducted, besieged, bombarded, tortured, sexually abused, and forcefully disappeared the people of Syria. They have been denied food and medicine, and their children have been recruited as child soldiers. Tens of thousands more have perished and continue to languish in prisons without due process. Throughout the conflict, the regime has also resorted to chemical weapons in the war it waged against its own people. The audacity of the Assad regime clearly demonstrates the grave consequences of impunity. Such war crimes and crimes against humanity cannot and should not go unpunished. We must utilize all available avenues to pursue accountability for the use of chemical weapons and therefore welcome IIIM's expanding work. Mr. Chair, you have underlined that the Security Council needs to acknowledge the prevailing accountability gap in Syria. For over a decade, it has failed to do so. Despite well-known disagreements within the Council, Syrian people's call for justice and accountability did not fall on deaf ears. The creation of the IIIM by the General Assembly demonstrated the membership's unwavering commitment to ensuring accountability for crimes committed in Syria. After all, it is the collective legal and moral obligation of the entire membership to protect Syrian civilians against the atrocities of the regime and to hold the perpetrators accountable. There can be no lasting peace without accountability and transitional justice. This is also the only way to foster reconciliation among Syrians, to prevent the reoccurrence of such crimes in the future, and allow for a genuine political transition to a new Syria. This will also enable the return of Syrians to their homes in a voluntary, safe, and dignified manner. As a co-sponsor of the General Assembly resolution which established the IIIM, Turkey welcomes the impressive progress of IIIM's operations across all aspects of its mandate, despite many challenges. We also applauded the cooperation between the IIIM and the OPCW, as well as civil society. Collaboration with civil society has proven crucial for the effective implementation of the mechanism's mandate. Indeed, civil society actors remain main agents for documenting the most serious crimes committed by the regime and terrorist organizations. We commend their bravery and express our appreciation to the Netherlands and Switzerland for their support to the Lausanne platform. Together with OPCW, IIIM plays a key role in ensuring that these crimes will not go unpunished and that impunity does not take root in the post-conflict Syria. The landmark ruling of the Koblenz court in February, which sentenced a former intelligence agent of the Syrian regime on charges of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity, is an important step in the right direction. We also recognize the importance of the Caesar photos, which documented the systematic nature of torture in Assad prisons, the subsequent trials in Koblenz, and the ongoing investigation in France. However, the road ahead to justice for atrocities committed in Syria will be both long and arduous. We will need to be steadfast in our commitment to ensure comprehensive and impartial accountability for years to come. Mr. Chair, in September, the UN published the first official death toll since 2014. Therein, more than 350,000 individuals killed in Syria are identified. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights declared that this is a conservative estimate indicating the minimum verifiable number of deceased. Despite this fact, these Syrians were identified by their full name, their place, and date of death. It is only right that we accord them the dignity in death that the Syrian regime took from them in life and recognize the unjust and unwarranted deaths of many more innocent Syrian civilians. The onus is upon all of us to hold the regime to account. Turkey will continue to fight for accountability in Syria and work towards achieving a political settlement in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2254. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Qatar.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية أتوجه بالشكر لشركائنا في تنظيم هذا الاجتماع بصيغة الآريا، وأشكر مقدمي الإحاطات على بياناتهم وبالأخص شهادات إخواننا السوريين وعد الخطيب وعمر الشغري. لقد شاركنا في رعاية هذا الاجتماع انطلاقاً من مسؤوليتنا الأخلاقية الجماعية تجاه الفظائع والجرائم الخطيرة التي لا حصر لها المرتكبة في سوريا خلال أزمة تجاوز عمرها الآن عقداً من الزمن، وهي جرائم لا تزال تنتظر المساءلة. كما تتواصل التقارير الدولية التي توثق الجرائم الخطيرة بما فيها الاستخدام المتكرر للأسلحة الكيميائية ضد المدنيين، ناهيك عن استمرار الانتهاكات الجسيمة والممنهجة، وحتى جرائم الحرب مثل الهجوم على مستشفى الأتارب ومستشفى الشفاء خلال العام الجاري. إن الفظائع المرتكبة في سوريا تعد الأكثر توثيقاً في أي نزاع، فمن استخدام الأسلحة الكيميائية المحظورة إلى القتل والاختفاء القسري والاحتجاز التعسفي على نطاق واسع وأنماط أخرى من الانتهاكات والفظائع التي تفوق الوصف. وفي هذا السياق تعتبر المساءلة أمراً حاسماً أكثر من أي وقت مضى لردع تكرار ارتكاب هذه الجرائم، وكذلك من أجل المصالحة والسلام المستدام الذي من شأنه أن يضع حداً للمعاناة التي لا حصر لها ولا يزال يعاني منها الملايين من أبناء الشعب السوري الشقيق. السيد الرئيس، إن دولة قطر ماضية في دعمها للعمل المتميز الذي تقوم به القاضية كاثرين ماركي أويل وفريقها في الآلية المحايدة والمستقلة IIIM، وهو عمل يتسم بالأهمية البالغة في جمع الأدلة وإتاحتها لتسهيل جهود المساءلة القائمة حاليا ومستقبلا. ونرحب بالمساعدة التي تقدمها الآلية للتحقيقات الدولية لدعم العديد من السلطات القضائية في ملاحقة مرتكبي الجرائم المرتكبة في سوريا. ومن خلال هذه الجهود أثبتت IIM كونها ترقى إلى نموذج الآلية الدولية المحايدة والمستقلة التي كان من المتوخى إنشائها عندما شرعت دولة قطر وإمارة ليechtenstein وشركائنا في التباحث حول أفضل السبل لاطلاع المجتمع الدولي بمسؤوليته القانونية والأخلاقية إزاء أخطر الجرائم المرتكبة في سوريا، وهي الجهود التي توجت في نهاية المطاف باعتماد قرار الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة رقم 71 على 248 الذي أنشأ الآلية. سيد الرئيس، لقد دأبت دولة قطر على إدانة الجرائم ضد الإنسانية وجرائم الحرب والدعوة للمساعدة على تلك الجرائم، كما استمرت في دورها كجهة مانحة إنسانية رئيسية، مع مواصلة التأكيد في الوقت نفسه على أن السبيل الوحيد للتغلب على الأزمة الإنسانية وأزمة حقوق الإنسان الخطيرة في سوريا هو الحل السياسي المستدام من خلال عملية سياسية شاملة بقيادة سورية ورعاية الأمم المتحدة تفضي إلى انتقال سياسي وفق بيان جنيف والتنفيذ الكامل لقرار مجلس الأمن 2254 بما يلبي تطلعات الشعب السوري ويحفظ وحدة سوريا واستقلالها. شكرا لكم سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the organization of this important meeting, and I would like to thank Mrs. Marchuel for her presentation and commend her work and that of her team. And I also thank the briefers for their powerful testimonies. Today, I want to address 3 points. Justice as a key element in the process leading to durable and sustainable peace in Syria, the much needed cooperation and support of all IIIM stakeholders, and finally, the importance of comprehensive and inclusive justice. Firstly, I would like to stress the relevance and importance of the mandate of IIIM in the search for durable and sustainable peace in Syria. Since the start of the Syrian conflict 10 years ago, the parties have continuously and repeatedly violated international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The victims number in the hundreds of thousands. Relatives and survivors continue to demand that all perpetrators be held accountable for their acts, a significant number of which can be characterized as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even the crime of genocide. Peace and justice should not be seen as opposing goals, but rather as mutually reinforcing. Secondly, the effective implementation of the IIIM's mandate depends on the good cooperation of all member states, civil society, as well as the United Nations system and other international organizations. Belgium encourages all states which have not yet done so to adopt a framework for cooperation with IIIM. Belgium, for its part, updated its legislation in 2019. The cooperation with IIIM is proceeding with regularity, speed, and efficiency. Since last year, the number of cooperation requests have risen. Furthermore, requests are becoming more and more specific. Belgium will continue to support adequate funding for the IIIM from the UN regular budget. Thirdly, I would like to commend IIIM's commitment to a comprehensive and inclusive approach to justice, in particular with regard to different categories of victims and survivors. Belgium welcomes the development of specific strategies with respect to sexual and gender-based crimes, as well as crimes against children. This approach contributes to the recognition of all victims and survivors, and as such, to the achievement of lasting peace in Syria. Mr. President, in conclusion, I wish to highlight that it's crucial for furthering the essential work done by IIIM that the financing proposal for the mechanism is adopted by all member states. Belgium remains committed to dialogue with all parties involved on the continued financing of IIIM under the regular budget. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important discussion, which Canada is pleased to co-sponsor. At the outset, allow me to convey my appreciation to all co-sponsors and participants here with us today. My delegation believes there is value in taking stock and refocusing our efforts on accountability in Syria. We hope that this discussion will be a positive and practical step in examining how we can work together particularly with our civil society partners, to fill what has been called Syria's accountability gap. I also want to thank our briefers for speaking to both the Council and the broader membership today, and particularly to Omar and Wahad for their testimony. It is an immense privilege to hear from you, and I have to only agree with my Dutch colleague on the moving images that we had the privilege to see today. Je tiens à remercier Madame Marchiuel pour sa mise à jour sur l'important travail du mécanisme international impartial et indépendant.
Impartial mechanism, the IIIM. Canada remains tireless in its support for the IIIM and for the Commission of Inquiry, and we welcome the important role that these organs play in continuing to ensure accountability in Syria. Since their creation, these bodies have played a key role, bearing witness to the root causes of the conflict in Syria. The Commission has indicated that over the last decade, the detentions, disappearances, torture, the denial of freedom of expression, discrimination, inequalities, housing problems, land ownership rights that are not upheld are violations which continue and are still current issues at a time when the Syrian war continues.
The value of this mechanism is highlighted even more in the absence of a Security Council referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, which many of our colleagues have already referenced today. Canada is proud to be among those member states that supported and co-sponsored the draft referral in 2014, which was unfortunately vetoed. While we face many challenges in the pursuit towards achieving tangible accountability outcomes for Syria, Canada remains steadfast in its commitment to support all efforts to investigate human rights violations, war crime, and crimes against humanity in Syria, and to pursue justice for such crimes, including for sexual and gender-based violence and the use of chemical weapons. What? In response to your question, that is why in March 2021, this year, Canada joined the Netherlands in an effort to hold the Syrian regime accountable for human rights violation under the UN Convention Against Torture. And I join my colleague Resolve in our action for accountability in this space. It is clear from our discussion today that we must continue efforts such as these towards breaking the cycle of impunity in Syria and filling the accountability gap. Accountability is a key component to achieve a sustainable peace in Syria, and these efforts are necessary to defend and uphold a rule-based international order. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me state that we are honored to be joining you in co-sponsoring of today's meeting on such an important and challenging issue. I would like to also thank all the briefers. I want to thank also Omar and Wad for their powerful testimonies. We share concern over the blatant violations of international law, committed war crimes that are targeted killings, hostage-taking, torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and other forms of violence committed in Syria, primarily by the Syrian regime, but also other parties of the conflict. We are extremely concerned that after a decade since the beginning of the conflict, people of Syria continue to suffer enormously while impunity is still prevailing. Despite some progress in the last period to hold perpetrators accountable, owing to the strong efforts by individual countries, UN entities, and civil society groups who work tirelessly in this regard, without unanimity in the UN Security Council on this matter, the international community thus far has been unable to fully uphold Syrian people's fundamental right to justice. The issue of impunity also sets a dangerous precedent for the other current and future crises in other parts of the world. In this situation, we believe that revival and intensification of discussions in the Security Council on accountability in Syria in various formats is utterly important and timely. Given these serious obstacles to the international efforts for systematic and comprehensive solution, we commend national measures taken by some countries, including investigations and court proceedings against perpetrators. While these measures do not account for an ultimate solution, they send a clear message to those responsible for the crimes against humanity, as well as to the victims. Georgia co-sponsored and has fully supported UNGA resolution that established IIIM, and we believe that this mechanism, together with the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, will continue to facilitate and expedite fair and independent criminal proceedings in accordance with international law standards. But we also believe it is crucial that Security Council addresses the persistent accountability gaps in swift and comprehensive manner. We remain committed to continue our support and engagement with the international community in its endeavor aimed at ending impunity and bringing justice for the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for bringing us together today. This is an important meeting. I would like to start thanking our briefers today, not only for their briefings here, but also for their very important work. Whenever we address the situation in Syria, we must not forget how the Syrian conflict began almost 11 years ago. It was ordinary Syrians who took to the streets in order to peacefully call for reform, freedom, justice, and respect for their rights. But the Syrian regime responded with even more oppression, violence, torture, murder, and by waging a war against its own people. Indiscriminate detention, forced disappearances, torture, physical and sexual violence, and other human rights violations continue to take place on a daily basis in Syria. The regime in Syria has killed its own people using chemical weapons. This is why millions of Syrians have fled their country and are in fear of returning home. Systematic and wide-scale violations of international humanitarian law and abuses of international human rights continue to occur in Syria. The Commission of Inquiry confirmed that such violations and abuses might constitute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other international crimes. National reconciliation and sustainable peace in Syria will not be possible without justice and accountability for the most serious crimes and atrocities committed during the Syrian conflict. Clearly, the penal court in Syria will not bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice. We therefore continue to urgently call on the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Russia and China must stop vetoing such a referral. Yet, in the absence of prosecution by the ICC, there are important efforts to fill the void. Different organizations and entities are documenting violations and abuses of international law. The International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria continues to collect and to analyze evidence on international crimes. We fully support global efforts, in particular through the mechanisms created within the OPCW, to ensure accountability for perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. The international community must demonstrate that those responsible for chemical weapons attacks cannot act with impunity. Also, national courts have started prosecuting the most serious crimes committed in Syria. The conviction of a former Syrian regime official by a court in Germany in February 2021 for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity in connection with torture in prisons run by the Syrian regime was only a first step towards providing justice and accountability. But it has sent a clear message. Those responsible for crimes, atrocities, and abuses in Syria will be held accountable. This and other judicial developments in national jurisdictions represents a signal of hope for tens of thousands who have suffered at the hands of the Syrian regime. Truth, justice, and accountability are also necessary with regard to the tens of thousands arbitrarily detained, missing, and disappeared persons. The Syrian regime must release all arbitrarily detained persons, allow immediate, unconditional, and unhindered access to all its prisons and detention facilities, and inform the families of the fate of their loved ones. In this context, we also welcome the Commission of Inquiry's recommendation for the creation of an independent mechanism with an international mandate to coordinate and to consolidate claims regarding missing persons, as well as the mandate in the Third Committee resolution on the situation of human rights in Syria for the Secretary General to conduct a study on how to bolster efforts to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing people in Syria. For us, it remains clear, in order to reach a political solution to the Syrian conflict and to achieve sustainable peace and stability in Syria, we need justice, accountability, and the respect for human rights, as well as the full implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 in all its aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and allow me now to make an intervention in my national capacity. The armed conflict in Syria has entered its second decade. What began as demonstrations and demands for democratic reforms was met with brutal force by the Syrian regime. Since then, Syrian people have gone through unimaginable suffering and experienced violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Hopes for the respect of human rights and the rule of law and an end to corruption were shattered by violence and extremism. The killings, torture, sexual violence, and forced disappearances continue to this day. We thank the briefers for their insights, in particular the Syrian civil society representatives, for sharing their personal accounts on torture and political detention. We join previous speakers in expressing our unwavering support to the fight against impunity and the need to bring to a conclusion the atrocities in Syria. We recall that all those responsible for war crimes or crimes against humanity must be held accountable. Considering that the regime is also perpetrating many of these crimes, there needs to be clear response from the international community. This is a common responsibility. However, a meaningful response has been lacking from the Security Council. Over the years, 16 Security Council resolutions have been vetoed, including on increasing humanitarian access to Syria. The vetoes also included a referral of Syria to the International Criminal Court in 2014, a draft resolution that Estonia, among 65 countries, co-sponsored, and over 100 NGOs supported. The threat of vetoes has been constant and disruptive. The Security Council is mandated to stop atrocities and to ensure that the perpetrators of atrocities are held accountable. The vetoes have prevented this from happening. The case of Syria is one of the starkest examples of why we need to limit veto power in cases of atrocity crimes being committed. The Security Council needs to take its responsibility. To fill the accountability vacuum, the international community has continued to seek to document atrocities for the future, when those responsible would be brought to justice. Estonia commends the work of all of the independent investigative bodies that have been established by the international community, both in Geneva and in New York, to assist domestic and international justice efforts. We are especially grateful to IIIM for their tremendous efforts and engagement with civil society representatives. Estonia commends the investigations by extraterritorial jurisdictions, including the important developments taking place in Germany that we heard about today. The universal jurisdiction investigations and prosecutions underway in several European countries and elsewhere will carry forward the hope for justice for victims. While considerable efforts to gather and maintain evidence into these atrocities are made, inaction by the Security Council continues to fuel the horrific actions in Syria. To regain credibility in the eyes of the international community, this and the upcoming membership of the Security Council needs to hear the victims, stop the ongoing atrocities, and ensure the prosecution of perpetrators. Thank you. And we will now turn to the Security Council members, and I give first the floor to Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Señor presidente,
Mr.
agradecemos a
President, we thank
Estonia,
Estonia,
a su delegación y a las demás
its
delegaciones
delegation
copatrocinadoras
and other
por
co-sponsoring
convocar esta
delegations for
reunión,
convening
así
this
como a los
meeting. And we
expertos
also
y a los
thank
miembros
the
de la sociedad
experts
civil
and the members of
por
civil
sus
society
presentaciones
for
que
their
conmueven
briefings,
o deberían
which
conmover
were moving or
profundamente la
should
conciencia de cada
have
uno.
deeply moved each
En
and every
marzo
one
de
of us
este año
and piqued our
se
conscience.
cumplieron
In
10
March
años
of
desde
this
el
year,
inicio
we
del
marked
conflicto
10
en Siria.
years since the beginning of the
Durante
conflict in
esta
Syria.
década
During
se han
this
cometido
decade, we have seen the
incontables
perpetration of
inimaginables
countless,
crímenes
unimaginable,
graves de trascendencia para la comunidad
grave
internacional
crimes,
en su conjunto.
serious crimes of
Como
concern
ya se ha
to the
mencionado,
international community as a
como
whole.
acaba de decir
As has already been
usted, señor
stated, and
presidente,
as you have just
los
said,
esfuerzos de
Mr. President,
algunos miembros del
efforts of
Consejo
some
de
members of the
Seguridad
Security
por
Council
remitir la situación
to
de
refer
Siria
the
a la
situation in
Corte
Syria
Penal
to
Internacional,
the International
como
Criminal
se
Court,
contempla en el
as
artículo
is provided
13b
for in
del
Article
Estatuto de
13b
Roma,
of the Rome
se han visto
Statute.
bloqueados
These
por el
efforts
veto
have been blocked
una
by the
y otra
use
vez.
of the veto time and
El
time
veto no
again.
debería
The
ser
veto should
utilizado
not be
cuando
used
se trata de
when
evitar
what is at
o poner
stake is
fin a la
avoiding
comisión de
or
atrocidades
putting an
en
end
masa.
to the perpetration
La
of mass
iniciativa
atrocities. The
franco-mexicana
Franco-Mexican
de
initiative,
restricción voluntaria
designed
del
to
veto,
voluntarily
a la
restrict
cual
the
se
use
han
of the veto,
adherido
is an initiative to
105
which
estados,
105 states
cristaliza
have acceded.
esta premisa.
And as an
Desde la
initiative,
perspectiva de
it
México,
gives
el veto
tangible form
tampoco
to
debería
this
ser utilizado
premise.
para impedir la
In
remisión
Mexico's
de
view, the
situaciones a
veto
la
should
Corte
also
Penal
not be used
Internacional
to
en las
prohibit the
que
referral of
pareciera que
situations
se han
to the
cometido
ICC
crímenes
if it is
que
deemed
son
that in these
competencia de
situations
esa Corte.
crimes within the
Es
court's remit have
precisamente
been
ante la
committed. It is
imposibilidad del Consejo
precisely
de
out of the
Seguridad
Council's
de remitir la
inability to
situación de Siria a
refer
la
the
Corte
situation
Penal
in Syria to
Internacional
the
que surge
ICC
el mecanismo
that
internacional
the
independiente e imparcial para
IIIM
Siria.
has been born. That
México
is the
lo ha
international
apoyado
impartial
desde su
and
creación
independent
hace
mechanism.
5 años
MECO
y lo
has
seguirá
supported
haciendo.
the creation of its mechanism,
Subrayamos
the
que el
mechanism. It
mandato
always
del
has done, and we did so when it was established 5 years ago. We
permite que su
underscore
trabajo
that the
como
IIIM's mandate
repositorio de evidencia
allows its work
se
as a
utilice
repository
en
of
el
evidence
futuro
to be
en
used
procesos penales,
in the
ya sea en
future
cortes
in
nacionales,
criminal
regionales
proceedings underway
o
in national,
o las de
regional,
carácter
or
universal.
international or
Esto resulta
universal
pertinente
courts.
puesto que la
This
gravedad
is
de los
relevant
actos
given
cometidos en
that the
Siria
grave nature
y
of
sus
the acts
consecuencias
committed
para
in
la
Syria
población
and their
civil
consequences
requiere que se
for
exploren
civilians
todas las vías
mean
de
that we
acceso a la
must
justicia,
explore all possible
incluyendo el
pathways of
ejercicio
access to
del
justice,
principio de la jurisdicción
including the
universal,
exercise
como
of
lo
the
hacen ya
principle of
algunos
universal
estados,
jurisdiction. This
notablemente
principle
con
is
los
already
con
been
los juicios de Koblenz
exercised
en Alemania,
in a number of
que nos
states,
acaban de ser
notably in the
relatados
trials
por el
of
doctor
Koblenz
Kress.
in Germany that have been
Procesos
recently
penales
outlined to us
en
by one of our
jurisdicciones
briefers.
nacionales
Criminal
confirman
trials in
el
national
valor
jurisdictions
de este
confirm the
mecanismo
value
cuya
of this
labor de
mechanism, whose
investigación,
work to
compilación y
investigate
análisis
crimes, compile and
resulta
analyze
central
evidence is
para la
vital
formación de
for the
expedientes
creation of
judiciales
judicial
sólidos.
files. solid judicial files in particular. I'd also like to recognize the work of the investigation and identification team of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This team has undertaken important work in order to identify the perpetrators of chemical attacks in Syria and to avoid such acts remaining unpunished. The Commission of Inquiry for Syria of the Human Rights Council has documented the fact that war crimes and crimes against humanity continue to be perpetrated by the various parties to the conflict. These three mechanisms aforementioned must be able to work in a coordinated fashion and with a unity of purpose to ensure that justice can be done and to ensure that we put an end to any impunity in Syria. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Chair, for bringing us together today. We welcome the opportunity to discuss this critical issue. And I'd also like to thank our briefers for their important contributions and their compelling testimony. During more than a decade of conflict in Syria, the most heinous crimes have been committed. The perpetration of war crimes and crimes against humanity has shocked us all. Accountability for these crimes is vital. This is not only key to ensuring the right of the Syrian people to truth, justice, and effective remedies, but it's also essential for a just and sustainable political solution in Syria. It is our common responsibility as members of the international community, and in particular as members of the Security Council, to ensure accountability for those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Combating impunity would not be possible without the documenting of crimes. We commend the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, as well as the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, for their work to date in gathering extensive and detailed evidence of crimes committed in Syria. Ireland remains committed to supporting the work of the IIIM and the Commission of Inquiry, as well as the OPCW's fact-finding mission and investigation and identification team. Along with these international mechanisms, the role of civil society in documenting human rights abuses, assisting victims, and promoting accountability for those responsible is absolutely vital. Groupings such as the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons keep accountability issues high on the international agenda. And we also commend those states who've initiated proceedings to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity in their domestic courts. Chair, the situation of detainees and missing persons remains one of the greatest tragedies in this conflict. The psychological impact on the victims and their families is unconscionable, and Ireland continues to call on the Syrian authorities and on other parties to release all those who have been arbitrarily detained and abducted, and to make the fate of missing persons known. A generation of Syrian children have grown up knowing nothing but conflict. They have been failed time and time again. Grave violations of children's rights continue unabated, including recruitment, abductions, killing, and maiming. Girls are disproportionately impacted by sexual and gender-based violence and by the targeting of educational and health facilities. We must strive to protect children from harm, to vindicate their rights, and to hold those responsible to account. In closing, Ireland believes now more than ever that the Security Council and the international community as a whole should recommit ourselves to work for accountability for the crimes committed in Syria. It is our fervent hope that this could achieve the justice that the people of Syria yearn for and so richly deserve. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Norway.
Thank you. Thank you to Estonia and to the co-sponsors for convening this meeting, and a warm thank you to the briefers. Fundamentally, all parties to armed conflicts must comply fully with international humanitarian law and international human rights. It therefore follows that all allegations of violations of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights must be thoroughly, impartially, and effectively investigated. To ensure this creates an adequate deterrent and to secure justice for victims and survivors, this must be the case in all armed conflicts. Syria can be no exception. The effective, independent, and credible prosecution of the serious crimes that have been committed in Syria is therefore of the utmost importance. There must be accountability for the perpetrators, and the needs of the victims must be ensured. These will be important steps in a larger reconciliation process in Syria. Excellencies, human rights defenders and civil society voices, including those of women, also need to be heard, both in documenting what is happening in Syria and also to find a lasting and inclusive solution to the conflict. We stress that support to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence is therefore also needed and must be age and gender sensitive and include access to healthcare, sexual and reproductive health and rights, psychosocial support, as well as access to justice. Additionally, last year, Syria was among the situations with the highest numbers of verified grave violations against children, and explosive ordinances continue to be a risk for children and others in Syria. Yet we know that deprivation of basic needs and violation of human rights are two key drivers of radicalization, and that the lack of protection of civilians can fuel spirals of violence and hamper sustainable peace. The use of chemical weapons in Syria is deeply troubling. These attacks have been well documented. The fact that chemical weapons attacks have been committed with impunity is truly unacceptable. All parties must adhere to the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons. Norway condemns all use of such weapons by anyone under any circumstance. The Commission of Inquiry, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria, the IIIM, and the OPCW are all vital tools in our quest to end impunity in Syria, and they have Norway's full support. Victims and survivors deserve justice. Norway welcomes all efforts to ensure accountability in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to India.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have taken note of the points made by various briefers today. The conflict in Syria has been continuing now for more than a decade. The discussions in the Council began in March of 2011 during the initial days of India's previous stint in the Security Council. From the beginning, the politicization and militarization of the conflict negatively impacted the regional and international mediation efforts. The persisting and repeated calls for regime change, external support to the armed groups in Syria complicated the situation and resulted in the growth of terrorism. Violence has been along sectarian lines, and terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, have entrenched themselves more than ever. India has always condemned all acts of violence in Syria, as well as violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, irrespective of who their perpetrators are. We have also condemned in the strongest terms all terrorist acts that have been and continue to be committed in Syria. India has been consistent in highlighting how acts of external players have contributed to growth of terrorism in Syria. Against this background, the issue of accountability cannot be discussed in isolation, nor can it be seen from the narrow perspective of acts committed by one side. Such an approach will be politically divisive and only exacerbate the problem and should therefore be avoided, particularly when the Council has made some progress by acting together to adopt Resolution 2585 earlier this year. The accountability for acts committed within the territory of Syria falls under the ambit of sovereignty of the state. This is a matter for Syrians themselves to deliberate and establish accountability for crimes committed. This cannot be done by external players. The external players need to introspect about their own actions that are driven largely by political and strategic motives, particularly its negative fallout over more than a decade on the Syrian population, particularly women, elderly, and the children. The external players need to do everything possible to support the efforts of the Special Envoy. Lastly, let me reaffirm our commitment to advancing a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned UN-facilitated political process in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. India firmly believes that long-term security and stability of the region can only be achieved by preserving the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. Chair, distinguished colleagues, the importance of holding the guilty to account is hard to overestimate. If it's done successfully, it can help bring about long-term stability and peace. However, at the same time, a number of very important conditions must be observed. Firstly, efforts to combat impunity must be placed within the broader context of national reconciliation and should not preempt the outcome of that. Secondly, the appropriate mechanisms for investigations and accountability must be determined by the relevant state and its people. Preoccupation with international criminal justice, particularly in its transitional and post-conflict forms, has led to a number of experiments which did not meet those important conditions and can hardly be considered successes. In many cases, these sorts of mechanisms were used as instruments for regime change. The concept note for today's event refers to the Security Council's inability to refer the situation in Syria to the ICC. Let's think about a situation or situations when that referral did take place, Libya and Darfur. Can we really say that the ICC's work in those cases was helpful? Not at all. Everything that we've seen over these decades is simply a mix of selective justice and an absolute futility of efforts. The politicized and biased approach of the ICC did not help stabilize the situation in either of these countries or regions. Libya deserves a particular comment. The case against Muammar Gaddafi was fabricated by the ICC prosecutor in a matter of days. NATO countries used it as a grounds for overthrowing the regime and for carrying out large-scale bombings that literally annihilated a once prosperous country. As time has shown, the allegedly irrefutable evidence used in the case against the Libyan leader proved to be the result of the usual doctoring, and after the scandalous publications in the press, this is now very well known. Did this make the situation for Libya any easier? A country which continues to be in ruins, or perhaps the ICC started to investigate the cases of illegal NATO airstrikes that led to the casualties among the civilian population? Not at all. The role of the ICC in Libya is not just a story of shame, it's a crime committed that led to the downfall of a country and many years of suffering for its people. Those who allowed this, with their participation in the fabrication of false evidence, need to bear responsibility for that. Until then, any talk of the Security Council referring other situations to the ICC in the future would be pure hypocrisy. Let's get back to Syria. This country is doing everything it can to put an end to violence, to combat terrorists, and to normalize the situation on the basis of political dialogue. Syria has not requested assistance from the UN to investigate crimes committed on its territory. Moreover, in Damascus, they have made it very clear that they do not need this assistance. Therefore, we would like to recall the content of Article 2, Paragraph 11 of the UN Charter. The UN does not have the right to intervene in matters which are within the domestic jurisdiction of any state.
Создание так
The creation of
называемого
the so-called
беспристрастного
impartial
независимого
and
механизма по
independent
расследованию
mechanism for the
международных
investigation
преступлений
of
в Сирии
international crimes in Syria,
в отсутствии согласия
in the absence
Сирийской
of the
Арабской
consent of
Республики
the Syrian Arab
или
Republic
резолюции
or a
Совета
resolution of the
Безопасности,
Security
принятой в
Council
главе
adopted under
7 Устава
Chapter
ООН,
7 of the UN
грубо нарушила
Charter,
принципы суверенного
was a gross
равенства всех
violation of the
членов
principles of the sovereign
организации
equality
и
of all members of
невмешательства
the
в внутренние
organization
дела,
and non-interference in
закрепленных в
their
статье 2
internal
Устава.
affairs enshrined in Article 2 of the
Продавливание
Charter.
рядом государств
A number
членов
of states, member
создание
states
такого
forcing
механизма
through the
в
creation
Генеральной
of this
Ассамблее
mechanism in the
привело
General
к ситуации,
Assembly
при
led to a
которой
situation
один из
in which
главных
one of
органов
the
ООН
primary
вышел
organs
за
of the
пределы своих
UN
полномочий, закрепленных
exceeded
в Уставе
its mandate,
организации.
its purview as enshrined in the Charter of the
С учетом этих
organization.
факторов, резолюция
Taking these factors into account, Resolution
71/248 должна считаться ничтожной.
71/248 must be considered null
Как
and
следствие,
void.
все, чем механизм
Consequently,
занимается после
everything that the
принятия этой
mechanism has
резолюции,
done since that
находится вне
resolution
рамок
was adopted
Устава
is
ООН и
outside the
международного
bounds
права.
of the UN Charter and international law.
Любые сведения или собранные
Any
таким механизмом
information or
доказательства
evidence
не могут
gathered by the
использоваться для цели
mechanism cannot
какого-либо
be used
возможного национального или
for the purposes of
международного
any
уголовного процесса.
national or international criminal proceedings.
Уважаемые коллеги, мы с уважением
Distinguished
относимся к
colleagues, we
позиции
respect the
делегаций,
positions
которые
of
искренне хотят
delegations that
способствовать
sincerely want to
установлению
help
справедливости в Сирии.
establish justice in
Мы
Syria.
стремимся к тому
We're
же.
trying to do the same thing.
Российская Федерация
The Russian
последовательно отстаивает
Federation
принцип,
has
согласно
consistently
которому
defended
решение
the
вопросов
principle
привлечения
that
к
resolving
ответственности и
issues of
наказания
accountability and
не должно
punishment
идти в ущерб
must not
политическому
be done to the
регулированию.
detriment of the political
Наоборот,
settlement.
эти два
Quite
процесса
the
должны
opposite, those two
содействовать друг другу.
processes must support one another.
Россия привержена задаче
Russia
скорейшего
is
достижения
committed
мирного
to
регулирования
the
в Сирии
prompt
и прилагает для этого максимум
establishment of a
усилий.
peaceful
Благодарю
settlement
вас.
in Syria and is making every effort to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Vietnam.
The Chair. I thank the briefer for sharing their views today. This decade-long crisis and also deadlock has brought nothing but suffering to the Syrian people, and millions of them are now suffering. They're struggling with their daily life, and without a sustained solution, it is undoubted that the future generation in Syria will continue to bear the burdens of the protracted socio-economic consequence of this conflict. Mr. Chair, the only one way to overcome the current crisis is to set aside the past, the differences, and exert every effort toward the advancement of a long-awaited peace process in Syria. The unanimously adopted Resolution 2254 clearly set out a political solution, which is led by the Syrians, facilitated by the UN, fully adhere to the international law and the UN charters, including commitments to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. It's now high time to promote dialogue and confidence building measures to this end, both among the Syrians themselves and international interlocutors. While difference still prevails, my delegation takes note of the fact that efforts toward finding a political solutions have been made by relevant parties as well as international partners, including regional countries. This effort necessitates the unwavering support from the international communities, including the Security Council. We are at a turning point to do so for the Syrian people, taking advantage of this longest period of calm since 2011. Mr. Chair, the alleviations of the dire predicaments of the Syrians is also a matter of urgency. Protecting civilian and civilian infrastructures is critical. Therefore, obligations under international law, particularly humanitarian laws, must always be respected by all parties on the ground. My delegation also called for the enhancement of humanitarian response in order to cope with the current alarming situation. We fully support the efforts towards strengthening recovery capabilities and resilience of Syrian people. All those goals cannot achieve as long as the international community remains deeply divided, Mr. Chair. We call for renewed efforts in the most constructive and non-politicized manner with a view to fulfilling the aspirations for peace and development of the Syrian people. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to China.
Mr. Chair, first of all, I would like to state that Chinese participation in this meeting does not mean that we endorse or approve of the narrative and the position of the meeting's concept paper. In fact, the permanent mission of Syria has circulated a memorandum on this meeting, arguing that a meeting such as this interferes in its internal affairs, contravenes the purpose and the principle of the UN Charter, distorts the truth about the Syrian civil war, and chooses to overlook selectively important issues that cannot and should not be ignored. It's been 10 years since the beginning of the civil war in Syria. over
非
the
法入
decades,
侵、
illegal
外部占领、
invasion, foreign
恐怖
occupation,
主义、
terrorism,
单边制裁，
and
给
unilateral
叙利亚人民
sanctions
带来巨大灾
have
难。
brought untold misery and suffering onto
对
the
这
Syrian
10年的
people.
悲惨历史
Such
进行回
tragedies
顾
call
和
for
追责，
review and
有许
accountability,
多深刻教
as
训
there are
值
many
得汲
profound
取。
lessons to be learned.
一个国家选择什么样
What
的
a
政
country
治制度
chooses
和
in
发
terms
展
of
道
its
路，
political system and its
这个国家
development
的人
path
民最
is
有
up
发
to the
言权。
people of the country, as they are
尊
best
重主
positioned
权
to speak
和
on
领
such
土完整，
issues.
不干涉内政，
Respect for sovereignty
是
and
联合国
territorial
宪章确
integrity
立的基
and
本原则，
non-interference in internal
必
affairs
须始
are the
终
fundamental
坚决维护。
principles established by the UN Charter.
破坏这些原则
And
只会造成国
must
际关
always
系
be
混乱，
firmly upheld.
引发动
Undermining
荡，
such
甚
principles
至
will
灾
only
难。
create chaos in international relations and lead to turmoil and
恐怖
even
主义
disasters.
没有好坏之分，
There is
搞
no
选
good
择
or
性
bad
反恐，
terrorism, engaging
甚至
in
为了政治利
selectivity
益
when fighting
对恐怖
terrorism,
分子
or
随
even
境
appeasing
利用，
terrorists for
最
political
终将搬
interests
起石
will
头砸
eventually
自己的脚。
backfire.
民主是全人类共
Democracy
同
is
价
a
值，
common value for all
同时民
mankind,
主的实现
but there
没
is
有固定
no
模式。
set model for
外
for
部
its
强加民主
realization.
是对民
The
主价值
imposition
的
of
最大破
democracy
坏。
from the outside in itself does the greatest
人
damage to
权是各
democratic
国人民的
values.
共同追求，
Human rights are the
生
common
存
pursuit
权
of all、
发
peoples.
展权
The
是
right to
首要的
survival
基本
and
人
the right
权。
to development are the primary
把人权
fundamental
问题
human
政治
rights.
化、工具化，
Politicizing and
以保护
instrumentalizing
人权
human
为
rights
由干
issues,
涉别国内政，
interfering in the
制
internal
造
affairs
分
of
裂、
other countries
对
on
抗
the
和冲
pretext
突
of，promoting human
是对
rights,
人权理念的
creating
莫大
division,
讽刺。
confrontation, and conflict. These actions represent the
主
ultimate
席先
error
生，
to the concept of
主
human
办方
rights.
散发的概念
Chair,
文件似乎认为，
The
安
concept
理会
notes
在追
circulated
责
by the
问题上
organizers
做得还
seem
不
to
够，
suggest that the Council has
安理
not
会
done
还需要
enough
进
on
一
the issue
步
of
强化自
accountability,
身
and the
在这
Council
方面
needs
的
to
作用
further。strengthen its own role in this regard.
这样的看法如果不是
Such
错
a
误
view
的，
is
也是过于
overly
简单化
simplistic,
的。
if not wrong.
在叙利亚问题
On the
上，
Syrian
安理
dossier,
会的
the
首要责
Council's
任
primary
是推动落
responsibility
实
is to
第
promote the
224号决
implementation
议，
of Resolution
支持联合国秘书长特使开展
2254,
斡
support the good
旋，
offices of the Special Envoy
协
of the
助叙利亚
Secretary
各
General,
方加强
assist
对
the
话
Syrian，parties
增
in
进互
strengthening
信，
dialogue and
共
enhancing
同推
mutual
进
trust,
叙人主导、
and
叙
jointly
人所
promote
有
the
的政治
Syrian-led
进
and
程
the。Syrian-owned political process.
解决有罪不罚和追责
Addressing the
问
issue
题，
of
应当是整个政治进程
impunity
的
and
一部分，
accountability should be part
应
of the
当由
overall
叙利
political
亚作为
process,
当事国主
to
导
be
开
led
展。
by Syria as the country concerned.
关于将国别
With
局
regards
势
to
移
referrals
交
of
国际刑事法
country-specific
院，
situation to the
已经
ICC,
有个案证
there
明
is，evidence
提交国
that
际
shows
刑
that
事
some
法院
cases that have
并
been
不等于
referred to
司
the
法公正的完
ICC,
成。
referral in
有
itself
时
does
候
not
对
equal to
恢
justice
复和平
rendered.
安宁
Sometimes
并不能
it
起到
does not
促进作用。
facilitate the restoration of peace
中
and
方对未来
tranquility.
任何
Going
将
forward,
国别局势
China will
提交国
continue
际刑事
to
法院的
hold
提议
a prudent
都会继续
attitude
采取
on
十分慎
any
重的
such
态度。
proposals of referral to the ICC.
最后，
Finally,
关于叙利亚国
on
际
the
公正独立
triple
调查机制
IM，
我愿重
mechanism for
申，
Syria, I wish
中
to
方对这个
reiterate
机制始
that
终持
China
保留
has
意
always
见，
had
我们的立场没有
reservations
变化。
with regard to this
谢谢主席先
mechanism,
生。
and our position has remains unchanged. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And we will now proceed to the statements by other UN member states and permanent observers based on their prior inscription to the list of speakers. And let me remind you that in order to allow as many interventions and questions as possible, I kindly ask you to limit your interventions to no more than 3 minutes. And I now give the floor to Albania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank you and the other sponsors for organizing this meeting, as well as the briefers for their insightful presentations. Mr. Chair, in a few months, there will be 11 years since the peaceful uprising against the Syrian regime. 11 long years of war and repression, widespread destruction, massive loss of innocent lives, vast displacement of people, severe breaches of human rights, terrible pain pain and suffering. The very severe human rights situation in Syria remains a deep cause of concern. Albania reiterates its strong condemnation of the indiscriminate killing and deliberate targeting of civilians, including humanitarian workers. The Commission of Inquiry on Syria continues to report on gross human rights violations. This is utterly worrying and intolerable. We call on the Syrian regime, its supporters and all parties to the conflict to stop the violations of human rights and humanitarian law and fully engage in the Syrian-led political process, including the Constitutional Committee's work in full compliance with the Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015. Mr. Chair, the culture of impunity from within the Syrian regime for the most serious violations and abuses of international law and human rights law committed during the conflict is unacceptable. Violations that rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity remain unpunished. Past conflicts have shown that peace and reconciliation are difficult to reach without genuine and continued efforts to address the culture of impunity, without proper accountability for the crimes committed. Therefore, every effort to collect evidence in the view of future legal action must be supported. Mr. Chair, Albania welcomes the steps taken by some countries to fight impunity in Syria through proceedings in their national courts, and we encourage a more coordinated action among countries towards this end. Mr. Chair, we know that efforts to address impunity in Syria will fall short if the Security Council remains idle. Lack of action by the Council in response to the gross human rights violations in Syria, particularly from the regime, would be seen wrongly and unavoidably as a license for further violations and abuses. It is therefore vital that the Council assumes its responsibilities in this regard and help address the culture of impunity in Syria. The Council needs to be more responsive towards the situation of gross human rights violations, and Albania will work in this respect. To conclude, Mr. Chair, we strongly believe that accountability remains of utmost importance for finding a suitable and peaceful solution to the conflict. We join others in calling for the situation in Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court. Albania will continue supporting the activities of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, IIIM, for Syria, as well as that of the Commission of Inquiry, and I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie les organisateurs et vous, Monsieur le Président, pour cette réunion, ainsi que les intervenants et intervenantes, surtout celles et ceux issus de la société civile syrienne, de leur contribution. Il y a près de 10 ans, mon pays, avec près de 60 États, a lancé les appels à déférer la situation en Syrie à la Cour pénale internationale. Le message reste pertinent. Il ne doit pas y avoir d'impunité pour les crimes internationaux commis en Syrie. Assurer la conformité avec le droit international et les responsabilités de toutes les parties au conflit restent des priorités pour mon pays. La reddition des comptes doit servir en premier lieu les victimes, les survivantes et survivants et leurs familles. Permettez-moi, à cet égard, de souligner 3 points. Premièrement, la société civile syrienne est un acteur clé sur la voie de la justice et la reddition des comptes. Beaucoup risquent leur vie en documentant les violations et en aidant les victimes. Leurs voix doivent être entendues, y compris dans des formats comme celui d'aujourd'hui. Un groupe de victimes et survivants syriens a récemment exprimé sa vision de la justice. Celle-ci dit, je cite, « La responsabilité pénale est un élément crucial de notre vision de la justice à long terme. Pour garantir cette responsabilité, il faut agir immédiatement et à l'avenir. En effet, si une justice compréhensive est encore lointaine, les bases doivent être jetées aujourd'hui. Cela m'amène à mon second point. La coopération entre le mécanisme international pour la Syrie, IIIM, les ONG syriennes et les procureurs nationaux commencent à porter ses fruits. Plusieurs procès pénaux pour des violations graves du droit international ont été lancés et certains conclus. Avec les Pays-Bas, la Suisse a contribué à ces importantes étapes grâce au processus de Lausanne, encourageant la coopération entre IIIM et les ONG syriennes. Les résultats sont un début encourageant. Il faut aller encore plus loin. Par conséquent, et c'est mon troisième point, ceux et celles qui luttent pour la justice et la reddition des comptes ont besoin du soutien durable de la communauté internationale. Le Conseil de sécurité a un rôle clé à jouer. Cela vaut pour les efforts en faveur de la reddition des comptes, mais aussi pour d'autres questions importantes en matière de justice et humanitaire. Il faut ainsi faire davantage pour réaliser le droit des Syriennes et Syriens de connaître le sort de leurs proches disparus et détenus. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, peace and justice are interdependent. We must also ensure a peaceful future for Syria. Switzerland continues to support the UN peace process, including by hosting peace talks in Geneva and enhancing civil society participation. Only a negotiated solution can end the conflict in Syria and guarantee the rights of all Syrians. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Australia thanks the Council for today's discussion, and Ms. Marchi-Uhel and Professor Kress and the representatives from Syria's civil society for their briefings. Mr. President, this meeting is an important opportunity to reiterate the Security Council's commitment to holding perpetrators of crimes against humanity and human rights abuses to account. The Secretary-General's latest report paints a grim picture of the ongoing situation in Syria. Particularly disturbing is the death of 323 civilians, almost half of whom are women and children, from hostilities in the period August to September 2021, and the ongoing violations of human rights, including reports of hostage-taking, arbitrary detention, and the continued use of siege tactics by regime forces. Mr. President, Australia takes this opportunity to reaffirm our strong support for the international, impartial and independent mechanism in its mission to collect and preserve evidence of the most serious crimes under international law committed in Syria, and calls for full cooperation with the IIIM by all parties to the conflict. Australia further calls on the Assad regime's full cooperation with the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The unaddressed discrepancies in Syria's initial declaration to the OPCW and repeated attempts to hinder the work of the Technical Secretariat and Declaration Assessment Team are unacceptable and represent further efforts by the Assad regime to avoid accountability for potential violations of international law and crimes against humanity. Without accountability, Mr. President, there is no credible prospect of lasting peace in Syria. After a decade of violence and human rights abuses, it is the duty of the international community to seek justice for victims. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Malta.
I begin by thanking Estonia, France and the United Kingdom, the United States and all additional co-sponsors for organizing today's Arria-formula meeting on accountability in Syria. We also thank Ms. Marchi-Uhel, head of the IIIM, Professor Kress and Mr. Al-Shogri and Mr. Al-Khateb for enriching today's discussion with their thoughts, insights and experiences. Malta aligns herself with the statement that will be delivered by the European Union and would like to make a few additional remarks in her national capacity. Mr. President, last March we marked a grim milestone, the 10-year anniversary since the outbreak of the conflict in Syria. 10 years since the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people for a better future were quashed by a devastating civil war. 10 years of bombing, shelling, torture, terror, oppression, forced disappearances and violations of international humanitarian law. 10 years of sexual violence and rape of women, girls, men and boys. 10 years of conflict resulting in one of the most catastrophic and dire humanitarian situations on earth. 10 years during which more than 12 million people have had to leave their homes, and as a result of which over 90% of the population now lives in poverty and more than half is food insecure. A decade is a long time. However, the passage of time should serve to reinforce our demands for justice and accountability, and in the face of such horror and brutality, and not desensitize us. Malta shall continue to stress the need for justice and accountability, two essential elements if we want to achieve lasting peace in Syria. We owe it to the victims of these atrocious crimes and their families. we owe it to ourselves as members of the international community. Our message must be strong and clear. War crimes and crimes against humanity cannot and will not go unpunished. Perpetrators must never forget that justice will ultimately prevail. In this context, we reiterate our deep appreciation for the tireless efforts of Ms. Marchiuel and her team to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights violations and abuses, and assist in the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the most serious crimes under international law. In doing so, the IIIM is also offering hope for victims. Malta has been a strong and proud supporter of this initiative from its inception. Today, more than ever, it has become increasingly clear that we must join forces to make sure that the mechanism is given all the necessary support to carry forward its mandate in a transparent and unhindered manner. In this context, we also underline the important work of the OPCW and welcome the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity under national jurisdictions. Mr. President, Malta emphasizes the need for a nationwide ceasefire in Syria and a political solution based on Security Council Resolution 2254. This is the only way forward. We also take this opportunity to underscore, once again, the importance of the cross-border mechanism as it has provided a lifeline to millions of people in Syria. We stress that the needs of the Syrian people should be at the forefront of all our considerations and that humanitarian actions must never be politicized. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Italy.
Mr. President, let me thank Estonia and the other co-sponsors for organizing this important and timely meeting on accountability in Syria. I'm also grateful to the briefers for their compelling remarks. While aligning ourselves with the statement that will be delivered by the European Union, I would like to give some remarks in my national capacity. Mr. President, we are concerned about the continuing deterioration of the Syrian crisis in all respects. The tragedy that has been unfolding in Syria for more than a decade has taken an exceptionally heavy toll on Syrian people in terms of loss of lives, systematic violation of human rights, vast destruction of its livelihood and infrastructure, and massive displacement of 1 million of civilians. This enormous suffering is now further aggravated by the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis, while a full stabilization on the ground is far from being achieved. Humanitarian needs in Syria have continued to increase at levels even higher than during the armed conflict. As the international community, we have the responsibility to do our utmost to support the Syrian people in terms of life-saving assistance and rehabilitation of basic services. That, however, should not weaken our commitment to the principles of accountability and justice for victims, which remain essential requirements for a stable and peaceful Syria. At the same time, prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity under national jurisdiction, where possible, can make an important contribution to securing accountability. We reiterate our full support for the existing mechanisms to fight impunity, such as the IIIM, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Investigation and Identification Team, and the Commission of Inquiry. Our priority today is to have a proactive approach in supporting a credible, inclusive, and viable political solution in accordance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. Therefore, we are committed to ensuring maximum support for UN Special Envoy Pedersen in the implementation of provisions of Resolution 2254 that will follow a comprehensive approach and include issues of major relevance to any reconciliation effort, such as detainees and missing persons. In this framework, and despite the setback of the Constitutional Committee's 6th session last October, due to the position taken by the Syrian government delegation, we fully supported the relaunching of the Constitutional Committee track as a Syrian-led platform for constructive dialogue among parties. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the European Union.
Thanks so much, Chair, and thank you also for the co-sponsors for organizing this extremely timely meeting. And I also want to direct a particular thank you to the very powerful testimonies that we heard earlier this afternoon here in this chamber, and I want to say that those testimonies have reinforced the commitment of the wider UN membership to press ahead for justice and accountability for the serious crimes committed in Syria during the last decade by all parties. The European Union and its member states promote and stand for a global order based on the rule of law. We believe that there cannot be sustainable peace without justice in Syria or elsewhere. We are determined that the crimes perpetrated during the last 10 years, since Syrians took to the streets to demand democracy and the respect for their human rights and fundamental freedoms, will not defeat the Syrian people's aspirations for dignity, justice, and for peace. Accountability and justice for victims are essential for a stable, peaceful Syria, based on a credible, inclusive, and viable political solution in accordance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. It is our common responsibility as international community that those responsible for war crimes or crimes against humanity must be held accountable. The atrocities committed, including the tragedy of the disappeared, for which the regime and its supporters bear the main responsibility, need to be brought to a conclusion. Therefore, we once again call upon the Security Council, as many others have done here today, to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. With the view to prepare and facilitate future proceedings before international and domestic tribunals, the European Union and its member states strongly support efforts to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. This includes our continuing support to the IIIM, as well as to the work of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, in order to ensure that facts surrounding the crimes committed in the course of the conflict are well documented, including the enforced disappearances described in the reports of the Commission of Inquiry. We will continue to fully support and cooperate with the IIIM, as well as complementary mechanisms contributing to the fight against impunity, such as the Commission of the Inquiry and the Investigation and Identification Team of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity under national jurisdiction, where possible, can make an important contribution to securing accountability. A number of such proceedings are underway in several European Union member states, as we've heard this afternoon, and the initiative of the Netherlands to invoke Syria's responsibility for human rights violations represents an important contribution towards securing justice. Unquestionably, while joining in the call for justice and accountability, we must continue to support the Syrian people in need. Humanitarian needs in Syria have continued to increase. From 11 million people in 2020, there are now 13.4 million people in need in 2021. The European Union, as the largest donor to this cause, has provided 22 billion euros during the last 10 years, an average of 2.2 billion euro every year. We will continue to show our solidarity, and we ask others, who sometimes are just seeking divisions, to do the same. We must also continue to press for the political process to move forward and support the efforts of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, to advance all aspects of Security Council Resolution 2254 in a comprehensive approach. This includes the issue of detainees in the hands of the regime and missing persons, and the establishment of a safe and neutral environment in order for free and fair elections to be held under United Nations supervision. And let me repeat, there's no contradiction between moving forward in all these aspects and ensuring accountability and justice. And finally, Mr. Chair, we continue to encourage the work of the Syrian-led Constitutional Committee. I thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg salue l'organisation de cette réunion Arria du Conseil de sécurité sur la responsabilité en Syrie et remercie tous les intervenants pour avoir partagé leur expertise et leur expérience à ce sujet. Nous saluons en particulier le courage et la persistance d'Omar et de Ouad. Votre appel à l'action au nom des victimes de la guerre en Syrie nous a profondément touchés et nous espérons qu'il sera entendu
and we hope that it will be
Le
heeded.
Luxembourg souscrit pleinement à la
Luxembourg fully
déclaration de l'Union
endorses the
européenne.
statement
Permettez-moi
made by the European
d'ajouter
Union.
quelques éléments
Allow
à
me to
titre
add a number
national.
of comments in my national
Depuis
capacity.
10 ans, la Syrie
For 10
s'enfonce chaque
years
jour
now,
un peu plus
Syria
dans
has
l'horreur
sunk
d'une violence
day by
aveugle
day ever
qui tue
deeper into
dans un
the horror
climat
of a blind
d'impunité.
violence which kills
Cette
people,
impunité
and where
est une des raisons
impunity
pour
reigns.
lesquelles le
This
régime
impunity is
syrien
one of the
et
reasons
les
for which
autres
the
parties au
Syrian
conflit
regime
en
and other
Syrie
parties to the
continuent
conflict
de
in Syria
commettre des crimes
continue to
dont les
commit crimes
populations civiles sont les premières
of which
victimes.
civilians are the primary
Alors que le
victims.
Conseil de
The
sécurité
Security
discute
Council does
régulièrement des
regularly
volets
discuss the
politiques,
political,
humanitaires et relatifs aux
humanitarian
armes
and
chimiques de
chemical
la crise
weapons
syrienne,
tracks of the Syrian
la lutte contre
crises.
l'impunité
However, the fight
doit
against
faire partie
impunity
intégrante
must
de
be
ces
an integral
discussions.
part of these discussions.
La promotion de la
The
responsabilité
promotion of
pénale est
criminal
en effet
accountability indeed
essentielle
is
pour assurer
essential
et
to
maintenir la paix et la
ensure and
sécurité
maintain
internationale.
international peace and
Nous sommes
security.
profondément convaincus
We
que la
fervently
justice est
believe
un
that
ingrédient
justice is a
indispensable
vital
pour ramener la
component to
paix en
bringing
Syrie.
peace to Syria.
Les preuves des atrocités
Evidence
commises
of
en Syrie
atrocities
s'accumulent
committed
au
in
fil des
Syria
rapports,
is building,
que ce soit les
with
rapports
every
de la
report
Commission
issued,
d'enquête
be these
internationale
reports from the
indépendante mise en place par le Conseil
Independent
des droits de
International
l'homme,
Commission of
les rapports
Inquiry
du
on
mécanisme
Syria
international
instituted by the
impartial
Human
et
Rights
indépendant,
Council,
le
be these the
IIIM,
reports of the
pour la Syrie, ou
IIIM,
encore les
all
rapports
reports
d'ONG.
of NGOs.
L'important
The
travail de
important work of
documentation en cours
documentation, which
est
is
crucial
underway,
pour que
is
le moment
crucial
venu,
in
justice
order to
puisse
ensure
être
that when the
rendue.
time comes,
Nous
justice
sommes
can be
fiers
done.
d'avoir
We are
soutenu
proud
le triple
of
IM
having
dès sa
supported
création en
the IIIM
2016 et nous
since its
saluons
creation
aussi
in
les efforts
2016, and we
entrepris par
also
les
welcome the
juridictions
efforts
nationales
undertaken
au
by
sein de
national
l'Union européenne.
courts within the European Union
Dès le début
in
de
this
son
field.
mandat
Since the
au
beginning
Conseil de
of
sécurité en
its
tant que membre
mandate
élu pour la période
with, as an elected
2013-2014,
member at the
donc en
Security
janvier
Council
2013,
from
le Luxembourg avait
2013 to
plaidé avec
2014,
56 autres États pour
Luxembourg,
que le Conseil
alongside
de
56
sécurité
other states,
saisisse
called
la
upon the
Cour
Security
pénale
Council to
internationale de la
seize the
situation en
prosecutor
Syrie.
of the ICC
La CPI
of
a
the
été créée
situation in Syria.
précisément
The
pour mettre un
ICC was
terme à
created
l'impunité des
precisely to
auteurs
put
des
an
crimes
end
les plus
to
graves qui
impunity
touchent
enjoyed by
l'ensemble de la communauté
perpetrators of the
internationale
most serious
et pour
crimes of
assurer
concern to the
effectivement la
international
répression de
community
ces
as a
crimes
whole.
quand
And it
un
was
État n'en a pas la
created to
volonté ou en
guarantee
est
that we can
incapable.
put an end to these
Tel est
crimes
bien le
when a
cas
state
de la
does not
Syrie.
wish to do so
Nous
or
avons
is
fortement
unable to
regretté
do
le
so.
fait que le
Such is
Conseil de
clearly the case
sécurité
in Syria.
n'ait pas
We
été
deeply
en mesure
regretted the
d'adopter
fact
une
that the Security
résolution
Council
déférant la
was not
situation
able
en
to
Syrie
adopt a
à la
resolution
CPI
referring the
le
situation
22 mai
in Syria to
2014
the
en raison du
ICC
vote
on the
négatif
22nd
de
of
deux
May
membres permanents du
2014
Conseil.
due to the
Plus de 7
veto
années plus
of
tard,
two permanent
les
members of the
crimes,
Council.
hélas,
More than
continuent.
7 years later,
Pour mettre
the
fin au
crimes,
conflit
alas,
et aux
continue.
atrocités en
To
Syrie,
put
il
an
est
end to the conflict and
indispensable d'œuvrer à
atrocities
une
in
solution
Syria, it is
politique.
vital to strive for a
Tout le monde
political
le reconnaît
solution.
et cela a
Everyone
été déjà dit
acknowledges
au cours
that
de cette
fact,
réunion.
and it has already been said
Or,
during
lutter
this
contre
meeting.
l'impunité n'est pas
Fighting against
incompatible avec
impunity,
la
however,
recherche
is
d'une
not
telle solution
incompatible
politique,
with
bien
the
au
search
contraire.
for such a political
Lutter
solution.
contre
Quite on the
l'impunité, c'est
contrary,
lutter
fighting against
précisément contre
impunity
ceux qui
is
attisent la
fighting
guerre et la
precisely
violence.
against what
Et nous
fans
devons
the
aussi
flames of
continuer de
war and
répondre
violence.
aux énormes
We
besoins
must
humanitaires
also
en
continue
Syrie.
to meet the
Et le
vast
Luxembourg
humanitarian needs
continuera là
in
aussi
Syria.
d'apporter sa part.
Luxembourg here too will
Face aux
continue
crimes
to
de
play
guerre et aux
its
crimes
role.
contre l'humanité commis
In the
en
face
Syrie,
of the war
nous ne
crimes and
cesserons
crimes
d'appeler
against
à la
humanity
justice
committed in
pour les
Syria,
Syriens.
we will
Je vous
never
remercie.
cease to call for justice for the Syrian
Merci.
people.
I
Thank
give
you.
the floor to Slovakia.
Mr. President, while aligning my delegation with the statement of the European Union, I would like to make a few remarks in national capacity. Slovakia thanks Estonia, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and additional co-sponsors for organizing this Arria-formula meeting. We concur with the objective of this meeting. Indeed, the Security Council needs to reinvigorate the accountability discussions and assume its responsibilities in this regard. Slovakia believes that accountability is an intrinsic part of a successful peace-building process leading to a sustainable peace. This assertion is not only anchored in the past experience, but recognizable also when looking at the conflict in Syria, which is in its 11th year. We remain witnesses of prevailing impunity for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. Mr. President, Slovakia appreciates the work of IIIM for Syria under the leadership of Ms. Catherine Markey-Uel in collecting, analyzing, and preserving the evidence of the crimes committed in Syria, and thus preparing the cases for ensuing prosecution. The number of requests for assistance received so far clearly manifests the value of the mechanism. As the mechanism lacks jurisdiction to try cases or prosecute the perpetrators, Slovakia underlines in this context that all jurisdictional grounds, including universal jurisdiction, have to be taken into account by national authorities. We note that several states have started structural investigations of the situation in Syria, which have, in a specific case, already led to a groundbreaking decision issued earlier this year. While all these efforts of different actors are laudable, they do not come close to addressing the magnitude of the Syrian crisis and cannot lead to a comprehensive accountability for serious international crimes in Syria. The Security Council has the power and the responsibility to do so, for instance, by referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. We reiterate our call in this regard. Mr. President, allow me to conclude by thanking the Syrian civil society for their endless commitment to ensuring accountability in Syria. They have a crucial role to play in the peace process. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ukraine.
Mr. Chair, we express our appreciation to Estonia and other organizers for convening this timely meeting. We're also grateful to our today's briefers. Ukraine resolutely condemns the Assad regime and its allies, primarily the Russian Federation, for massive, systematic, widespread, and grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Syria. Tens of thousands of people are missing, detained, and subjected to torture. Women and children keep bearing the biggest brunt of a brutal, decade-long conflict. There should be no place for impunity for the perpetrators of such heinous crimes. All of them, with no exception, must be held accountable for their actions. Victims and their families deserve nothing short of full justice. We have been closely following the activities of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria and those of IIIM, who collect evidences of different crimes, including murders, torture, and inhumane treatment of people of Syria. As one of the IIIM co-initiators, back in 2016, Ukraine strongly supports the mechanism. Like many others, we also cannot but reiterate the need for the referral of the situation in Syria to the ICC. Mr. Chair, unfortunately, as all of us well know, the Security Council remains in a deadlock on Syria. As it has been stated by my delegation on many occasions, the right of veto remains a major obstacle for resolving many conflicts, as some permanent members, first and foremost the Russian Federation, keep abusing their rights and privileges. Therefore, we need to find ways of how the Security Council can at least contribute to justice and accountability in Syria. As to the humanitarian situation, the Syrian government must allow safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance to all those in need, in accordance in particular with the Security Council Resolution 2585. Last but not least, a sustainable political solution to the conflict in Syria, as well as the political transition, should be implemented in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254 and the 2012 Geneva Communique. In closing, Ukraine reiterates its full support to the IIIM, the Commission of Inquiry, and the OPCW investigation and identification team in their crucial task of collecting evidences of crimes committed in Syria since 2011. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Denmark.
President, and thank you to you and the organizing member states for convening this meeting, and to not least to the briefers for their important work and their very insightful remarks today. Denmark aligns fully to the statement made on behalf of the EU and would like to add a few comments in our national capacity. Mr. President, sadly, the subject of accountability in Syria remains as important as ever. Since the beginning of the conflict more than 10 years ago, we have witnessed countless atrocity crimes against the Syrian people. These crimes involve the use of chemical weapons, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, targeted killings, torture, and gender-based violence. And these atrocities have been committed first and foremost by the Syrian regime. Reporting and documenting these crimes are crucial first steps towards accountability. Important work has already been done in this regard, not least by the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria and the Commission of Inquiry. Denmark continues to strongly support these mechanisms. However, we are still a long way from accountability. The regime continues to act with impunity. Denmark is deeply concerned by the continued widespread and systematic violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law committed across Syria. We applaud the efforts of member states to ensure accountability through national mechanisms. However, these efforts are not by themselves sufficient and cannot stand alone. It is crucial that the international community can hold accountable any party to the conflict who has been responsible for atrocities and crimes against the Syrian people. Denmark, therefore, calls on the Security Council to assume its responsibilities when it comes to ensuring justice and upholding respect for international law. Denmark strongly supports referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, and we note with deep concern the failure of the Security Council to take decisive action on this issue so far. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would now like to give the floor to a civil society organization, and namely to Mr. Ibrahim Olabi, Guernica 37 Chambers. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the last speaker, I feel an incredible amount of pressure to leave this council with a message of hope, and I will try to do so. Prior to joining Guernica 37 as a lawyer, growing up as a Syrian, I never, ever thought I'll be a witness to the mass historic injustices that I once read about in textbooks. Today, the world still holds a chance to hold perpetrators to account, as we have not yet became long, distant history. We are very much in the present, Mr. President. This present depends on what the world does today. And by world, I mean states. And by states, I mean individuals here with us in this room today. In the past, we may have had the excuse that we did not know about those crimes. But today, we heard over and over about the amount of evidence that is available. The IIIM, the Commission of Inquiry with 1,270 reports, pages, thousands of interviews, and that's just the Commission of Inquiry, let alone the OPCW, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, and the enormous evidence with the IIIM. All the presented evidence demonstrates how the Assad regime is the main, but not only perpetrator of atrocity crimes that you states present here today agreed for them to be crimes. And so when the Assad regime breaches those crimes, it's not a message to us Syrians. It's a message to every member state of that treaty that I can break those laws and I can get away with it. Yet, somehow, through deliberate disinformation tactics, Syria became a war where death is somehow inevitable, as if refugees fled war, not persecution by a brutal regime. Mr. President, Syria is not a war zone. It's a crime scene. And whilst wars may end, crimes linger on. With the crime scene known, the evidence widely available, and perpetrators clearly identified and named, why has this council not acted? We are grateful for some of the countries present here with us today who acted in their individual capacity. Netherlands and Canada using the Torture Convention, which may end up in front of the International Court of Justice, a process which we at Guernica are proud to assist with. Germany and France, with the numerous arrest warrants and cases that we've heard about today. And the UK, with investigation through its Metropolitan Police into high-level individuals and with its Foreign Office looking into collective ways of holding perpetrators to account, individual perpetrators to account for the use of chemical weapons. But why have I only mentioned Western states? Why have I not mentioned the Syrian state, as some member states today have mentioned? Well, with all that evidence, not a single prosecution, Mr. President, in Syria, and continuous vetoes blocking referral to the International Criminal Court. We are grateful to Estonia and all the co-member states for hosting the event here today, and the Council must keep accountability on the table. The Council must not shy away from naming perpetrators, starting with the Syrian regime, but not ending with it. Crimes are not committed by themselves, Mr. President, nor by states in abstracts. They are committed by people, and these people must be held to account. In response to the states that talked about sanctions, 14 Syrian NGOs and victim groups have called upon Assad to end sanctions. Yes, Assad. His crimes attracted sanctions to Syria. And if he would submit to justice and to the UN-agreed political solution, they will end. We call upon Assad's ally to get him to end sanctions on Syria. It has been said that if you torture one person, you may end up in prison. But if you torture hundreds of thousands, use chemical weapons, forcibly displace, you end up in a peace conference. We Syrians will fight to prove this saying wrong and change the course of history. We hope that you will all join us. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I will now give the floor back to our panelists to answer any questions and comments for closing remarks. And as we have 4 panelists and exactly 8 minutes, so please try to stay in 2 minutes. And first I will proceed I will do it in reverse order. And so first I will give the floor to Ms. Al-Khatib.
Thank you so much. From here, the term veto, which I heard several times now, might seem like a mere technicality. However, it wasn't. On 5th of December 2016, Russia and China voted this council resolution for a 7 days truce in Aleppo. 7 days only for safety and allowing aid for me, my family, and the people back in Aleppo. I join the member states who asked for limiting the veto power regarding mass human rights atrocities. So a 7 days of peace won't be such a difficult task to achieve. Second point, according to the Physician for Human Rights report, more than 90% of the attacks on hospitals in Syria are the responsibility of the Syrian regime and its allies, Russia and Iran. Those who are demanding accountability, we are demanding it for all attacks. We are not the ones who blocking international justice to the 90% of these attacks. Finally, Syria was not a civil war. It's not a civil war, so please stop referring to this in your statements. It was a peaceful demonstration. The whole world witnessed this, and will always be. We are not the one who are protecting criminals, and one day, as I see you all here, I'm sure that we, the survivors of Syria, will be joining these meetings as a free country, as people who respect human rights, who respect the future of all of us, and we will not be protecting criminals. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you, and I turn now to Mr. Al-Shugri.
State members who contributed and acted to help the Syrian people against dictatorship and help them during this crisis, I want to say thank you. And for the members who limited their actions to statements sometimes helpful, but most of the time they cannot limit the scream when they pull out your fingernails. You need to take actions. And for the member states who helped the Assad regime kill its own people, like the Russians, and the Chinese, the Iranians if they were here, and the disappointing statement from the Indians, I will tell you, let's assume your scenario that the Syrian regime is fighting terrorism and that you're helping the Syrian regime in fighting terrorism. Let's assume that. What regime, how could a regime be respected, fighting terrorism, respected after displacing half of its population? How could a regime stay in power when they actually have allowed the displacement of more than 14 million people? How could they be still in power when they detained me and there's proof that I was detained and tortured and my fingernails were pulled out? There is proof. Give me, I challenge you to get proof from the Assad regime showing that I did any crime. I challenge you to prove that I did any crime when I was detained as a minor, as a child. And so many people, survivors, try to tell their stories. When you tell your story, you risk your life. So many countries have taken these refugees in, but they failed to provide them with the protection. I was called by the intelligence services. I was called by the guard who tortured me for 1 year, 9 months in Syrian prisons, and he threatened me on the phone. And when I talked to the police, I had an answer saying, take care, be careful. That's not enough. I learned that from the war, from years in the war. I know I should be careful. So that's not enough. We need more help. Syrian people have fought for so long time. It's just tiresome to see fewer and fewer helping us. So I want to encourage you to take a step. The first step could be you just talk to this survivor. Don't listen to them on the phone. Come and shake their hands. Talk to them. Be present. Be close. That's how you take responsibility. In responding to the sovereignty of the Syrian regime, what sovereignty are we talking about? This regime has allowed the Russians to lead in Syria, the Iranians to kill in Syria. In Damascus, there's prisons where the Iranians have more power than the Syrian regime. That applies to the Russians in different locations in Syria. What sovereignty are we talking about? Again, I want to be grateful for the countries that gave me an opportunity to survive. I want to be grateful to Sweden that gave me a home. I'm a refugee in Sweden. I want to be grateful to Norway, where I found my first love after being in a hateful place in prison. And I also want to be grateful to the US, to Georgetown, where it's my new home, my new place, my new school. The world, despite all pain, despite all darkness, has hope. And I live for hope. I eat on this hope. I see that we have potential. If I survived 3 years of torture on a daily basis, starvation, and psychological torture every day, you can change. You can take actions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Professor Kress. Okay. And the final word to Ms. Marquiuel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
Nous souhaitons tous que le processus politique engagé pour régler la crise en République arabe syrienne aboutisse, bien sûr. Mais pour que ce processus aboutisse, comme le rappelait, comme le soulignait l'Assemblée générale lorsqu'elle a créé le mécanisme, il faut absolument faire que les responsables des violations du droit international humanitaire, des violations des droits de l'homme et des atteintes à ce droit qui ont été commises dans ce pays, que soit l'affiliation de leurs auteurs, il faut que ces crimes soient punis, to whichever group they belong, they need to be punished and held accountable for their acts. Today's debate has que nous devons, au sein du mécanisme, continuer notre travail, nous devons mettre en œuvre sans arrêter cet ambitieux mandat qui nous a été confié et non seulement soutenir les efforts de justice qu'un certain nombre des pays qui se sont exprimés aujourd'hui ont engagés, mais également préparer le futur, préparer le dossier qui un jour prepare files that one day, if we take action, will be ready and will allow victims and survivors of the crimes aforementioned to finally enjoy justice. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the discussion this afternoon, and I thank all the briefers, the Security Council members, wider UN membership and civil society for their interaction on this important topic. And I would also like to thank you for being so disciplined with the length of your interventions. We are exactly punctually here at 6 o'clock. And I kindly remind you to submit the statements in writing to the email address mentioned also in the concept note, that is mission.newyork@mfa.ee. Thank you very much.